true scary stories for sleep. Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. It was one of those nights where the world seemed asleep, and I was left alone with my thoughts, walking down an eerily quiet street. The usual city noises had faded, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. As I made my way home, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, just the dim streetlights casting long shadows. Yet the unsettling feeling lingered, a chill creeping up my spine. The street seemed to stretch on forever, each step echoing in the silence. My senses were on high alert, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't just any shadow. It moved differently, deliberately. It stayed just out of reach of the light, trailing me from a distance. I stopped, heart pounding, and turned around. The shadow halted too, almost as if it were mocking me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked faster, hoping to shake it off, but the shadow mirrored my every move. It wasn't until I broke into a run that it seemed to close in, almost feeding off my fear. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to outpace whatever it was, but no matter how fast I ran, it stayed close, always just on the edge of my vision. Finally, I made it to my apartment building, my sanctuary in the darkness. I fumbled for my keys, glancing back to see if the shadow had followed me inside. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, it disappeared. The weight lifted, but the unease remained, like a ghostly hand still gripping my chest. I locked the door behind me, but the memory of that shadow lingered, refusing to let go. I spent the next few days convincing myself it had been a trick of the light, an overactive imagination playing cruel games. But every time I stepped outside at night, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like the shadow was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to reappear. It didn't matter how brightly the street was lit or how crowded the area was. I could feel its presence. The worst part was not knowing when it would strike again. The uncertainty gnawed at me, turning every dark corner into a potential threat. I became paranoid, avoiding late-night walks and taking the longer, well-lit routes. But even in the daylight, the fear followed me like a dark cloud, always just out of sight. It was as if the shadow had imprinted itself on my mind, haunting me in ways I never imagined possible. One night, I found myself staring out of my apartment window, scanning the street below. It was empty, just as it should be. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Fleeting shadow, moving among the trees. My heart skipped a beat. Was it real, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't be sure anymore, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than anything else. I tried to sleep, but the night was full of unsettling dreams, shadows creeping into my subconscious. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that street, running from something I couldn't see. The dreams blurred the line between reality and fantasy, leaving me more exhausted with each passing day. Felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, one that followed me even when I was awake. Weeks passed, and I began to question my sanity. The shadow had become an obsession, a phantom that haunted my every thought. I told a few friends about it, but they brushed it off as stress or fatigue. But I knew the truth. That shadow was real, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I could feel it biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Then, one night, it happened. I was walking home, trying to keep my thoughts on anything but the shadow. But as I turned the corner, there it was, waiting for me. This time, it didn't follow me from a distance. It was right there in front of me, blocking my path. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I was frozen in place. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving behind only the chilling realization that this was far from over. The experience has left me forever changed. Even now, I can't walk down a dark street without glancing over my shoulder, expecting that shadow to return. It's a haunting reminder that some things can't be explained, and not all shadows disappear when the lights come on. It was a quiet night, kind where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I decided to take a late-night walk through the park, thinking the solitude would help clear my mind. The path was dimly lit, trees casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Everything seemed peaceful at first, but as I walked deeper into the park, I began to hear something. Footsteps. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there, echoing softly behind me. At first, I thought it might be another late-night walker, someone who, like me, sought solace in the quiet of the night. But as I continued walking, the footsteps didn't fade away. Instead, they grew louder, matching my pace. Chill ran down my spine as I realized that whoever or whatever was behind me wasn't just coincidentally following the same path. They were keeping up with me, step for step. I quickened my pace, hoping to outdistance the sound. The footsteps quickened too. My heart began to race as I turned around, expecting to see someone right behind me. But the path was empty. There was no one there. The only thing I saw was the shadows cast by the trees, swaying gently in the night breeze. It didn't make sense. How could there be footsteps without a person? I stood frozen for a moment, straining to listen, but all I heard was the rustling of leaves. I forced myself to keep walking, trying to shake off the fear that was creeping into my mind. But the footsteps returned, this time louder and more insistent. They were no longer a distant echo, they were right behind me. Panic set in, and I broke into a run, my footsteps pounding against the pavement. The faster I ran, faster the footsteps followed, as if they were chasing me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted through the park, desperate to escape whatever was pursuing me. I finally reached the edge of the park, where the lights of the city seemed like a beacon of safety. I burst onto the sidewalk, my heart still racing, and looked back one last time. The park was empty, as silent and still as it had been when I first entered. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a long moment, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation, no reason for the terror I had just felt. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe it had been an echo, trick of the acoustics in the park. Maybe it had been my own footsteps reverberating off the trees. But no matter how many logical explanations I came up with, I couldn't shake the memory of those phantom footsteps chasing me through the night. They had felt too real, too deliberate to be dismissed so easily. The next time I walked through the park, I couldn't help but feel on edge. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. But the footsteps didn't return. It was as if they had been a one-time occurrence, a chilling encounter that would forever haunt my memory. Yet every time I stepped into the park at night, couldn't help but listen for them, half expecting them to start up again at any moment. Then one evening, as I walked the same path, I heard them again. Faint at first, just like before. My heart sank, and I stopped in my track, fear gripping me like a vice. This time, I didn't run. I stood still, waiting for the footsteps to approach. But instead of growing louder, they faded away into the night, leaving me standing there, alone in the dark. It was almost as if whatever had followed me had decided to let me go, just this once. I don't walk through the park at night anymore. The memory of those phantom footsteps is too fresh, too eerie to ignore. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear them in my mind, echoing in the silence. It's a haunting reminder that some things can't be explained. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I catch myself listening for them, wondering if they'll return. The experience has left a mark on me, one that I can't easily forget. Even now, I can't walk alone at night without that familiar sense of dread creeping up on me. Those footsteps, though unseen, have become a part of me, a ghostly presence that lingers in the back of my mind. And I know deep down that if I ever hear them again, I'll be ready. Not to run, but to face whatever is chasing me. Walking home after a night out in the city always felt like a relaxing way to unwind. The streets were quiet, the lights casting a soft glow on the empty sidewalks. But that night, something felt different. Couldn't quite put my finger on it. But there was a tension in the air, feeling that I wasn't as alone as I seemed. As I strolled down the familiar path, I glanced behind me just to check. Nothing. Just the usual empty street. Silent and still. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I noticed it. A shadowy figure in the distance, just out of reach of the streetlight. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, close enough to send a shiver down my spine. Quickened my pace, hoping to put some distance between us. Every time I looked back, the figure seemed to be matching my speed, staying just far enough away to remain a mystery. Panic started to bubble up inside me, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just another person heading home, someone with no interest in me. But the way the figure moved, slow, deliberate, didn't feel right. I turned the corner, thinking that if I changed direction, they'd continue on their way. But as I glanced back, there they were, still following. The night had taken on an eerie quality, every shadow stretching out, every sound amplified. I was only a few blocks from home, and I told myself I'd just make it to my door. The figure hadn't made any threatening moves, hadn't even gotten close enough for me to see their face. But the silence, the way they followed without a sound, was more terrifying than any confrontation. I sped up, practically jogging now, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was there, always maintaining the same unnerving distance. By the time I reached my building, my heart was pounding, and I was fumbling with my keys, desperate to get inside. I stole one last glance behind me. The figure was gone, vanished. It was as if they had never been there. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and trying to catch my breath. The silence in my apartment was deafening, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. The fear was too real, the unease too strong to be a figment of my imagination. Following days were a blur of paranoia and self-doubt. Every time I walked home, I couldn't help but scan the streets for any sign of that silent follower. But they never reappeared. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, haunting presence I couldn't shake. I told myself it was over, that whoever or whatever had followed me that night was gone. But I couldn't convince myself completely. Weeks passed, and the memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the routine of daily life. But every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a faint footstep behind me, and the fear would come rushing back. It was as if the silent follower had left a piece of themselves behind, a shadow that haunted me long after they had disappeared. Then, one night, as I walked home from another evening out, I felt it again. That same unsettling feeling of being watched, of not being alone. I turned around, expecting to see the figure from that night. There was no one there. The street was empty, just like before, but the fear was back, stronger than ever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this time, the follower was much closer than I realized. I hurried home, the silence of the night pressing in on me like a weight. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow a potential threat. When I finally made it to my door, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as I fumbled for my keys, I glanced up, and there, just at the edge of the streetlight's glow, the figure. They were closer this time, close enough that I could see their outline, but still far enough away to remain a mystery. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and trying to calm my racing heart. The fear didn't fade, clung to me, chilling reminder that the silent follower was still out there, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, even now, through the darkness. And I knew that the next time I stepped outside, they would be there, waiting to follow me home again. The experience has left me forever wary, always glancing over my shoulder, always listening for that faint footstep behind me. The silent follower may be gone, but the fear they instilled in me remains, haunting presence that I can't escape. It was a foggy night in London, kind where the mist clings to the cobblestones, swallowing up everything in its path. I was walking home, the streets unusually deserted, when I saw a figure standing at the far end of the street. They were shrouded in the mist, barely visible, but something about their stillness caught my attention. I hesitated, feeling a shiver of unease creep up my spine, but I convinced myself it was just another late-night wanderer like me. As I got closer, the figure didn't move. They stood perfectly still, facing me, but I couldn't make out any details. No face, no distinguishing features. Just a dark outline against the fog. My footsteps echoed in the silence. The only sound in the eerie quiet. A sense of dread began to build inside me, but I pushed it down, telling myself it was nothing. Still, the closer I got, the stronger the feeling became, like an invisible hand tightening around my throat. When I was only a few yards away, the figure remained motionless, almost like a statue. I tried to see their face, to get some sense of who or what they were, but the fog seemed to blur everything. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I finally stopped, unable to bring myself any closer. That's when it happened. Without a sound, without any warning, the figure simply vanished. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone, swallowed up by the mist. I stood frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen, or rather, what I hadn't seen. There was no sound, no trace of the stranger, as if they had never existed. The street was empty again, fog swirling lazily around me. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. But the strangest part was what I found next. As I approached the spot where the figure had been standing, I noticed something on the ground. It was a piece of paper, old and yellowed, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and unfolded it. The message written on it was simple, but it sent a chill down my spine. "You're next." My blood ran cold, and I quickly looked around, expecting to see the stranger reappear. The street remained empty. The fog pressed in closer. I hurried home, the message clutched tightly in my hand. Once I was safely inside, I examined it more closely, trying to make sense of it. The handwriting was old-fashioned, almost Victorian, and the paper itself seemed ancient, as if it had been lying there for years. But that wasn't possible. The stranger had only just disappeared. I couldn't explain it. The words haunted me, echoing in my mind long after I had thrown the paper away. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked down that street, I half expected to see the figure standing there again, waiting for me. But they never reappeared. Still, the unease lingered, a chilling reminder that something, or someone, was out there, watching from the shadows. The message played over and over in my head, taunting me with its ominous warning. I began to avoid that street altogether, taking longer routes just to avoid the spot where the stranger had vanished. But the fear followed me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Every time I stepped outside, I felt their eyes on me, lurking just out of sight. It was as if the mist itself had become a living thing, wrapping itself around me, whispering dark promises in my ear. Then, one night, as I was walking home, I found another message. This one was tucked into my mailbox, neatly folded and waiting for me. My heart sank as I opened it, dreading what I might find. The words were the same as before. "You're next." My hands shook as I read the message, and I felt a surge of panic rising inside me. How had they found me? How did they know where I lived? I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, if the stress of that night had finally gotten to me. But the messages were real, as real as the fear that gripped me every time I stepped outside. I knew I couldn't keep running from it, couldn't keep pretending that it would all just go away. The stranger had vanished, but their presence lingered, haunting me in ways I couldn't explain. Finally, one night, I decided to face it. I returned to that street, fog thick and heavy around me, and waited. Hours passed and nothing happened. But just as I was about to give up, I saw them, standing at the far end of the street just like before. The same stillness, the same silence. And then, without a word, they disappeared again, leaving behind another message at my feet. "See you soon." The experience has left me shaken, forever wary of the shadows that lurk in the fog. I don't know who or what that stranger was, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the night they vanished, and I'll always be waiting for their return. New York City is never truly silent. But that night, as I took a shortcut through a dark alley, felt like the noise of the city had been swallowed up. The usual hum of traffic and distant chatter faded away, leaving only the sound of my footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, with shadows stretching out from every corner. I told myself it was just another shortcut, quick way to shave a few minutes off my walk home. But as I ventured deeper, an eerie feeling began to creep in. It started as a faint whisper, barely audible above the sound of my own breathing. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe the rustling of garbage in the alley. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to be saying something. My name. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen, but the whispers faded back into the silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the alley, searching for the source. There was no one there, just the empty street and the dim glow of a distant streetlight. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was all in my mind. But as I continued walking, the whispers returned, more insistent this time. They called my name again, soft and sinister, as if someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows, but the alley, still empty. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the whispers were coming from the walls themselves, echoing off the bricks like some kind of twisted echo. Panic began to set in, and I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the alley. No matter how fast I walked, the whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. They seemed to be coming from every direction, bouncing off the walls and swirling around me in a cacophony of voices. My name was repeated over and over, a haunting chant that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. As I reached the end of the alley, the whispers became a deafening roar, drowning out all other sounds. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the pavement as I sprinted toward the light at the end of the tunnel. The whispers chased me, their sinister tones wrapping around me like a vice. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see. All I could think about was getting out, escaping the alley and the voices that haunted it. Finally, I burst onto the main street, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. The noise of the city rushed back in, the sounds of traffic and people filling the air, but the whispers were gone, as if they had never existed. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. The alley behind me was silent and still, just another dark passageway in the heart of the city. But I knew what I had heard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been calling to me. In the days that followed, the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the whispers, the way they had seemed so real, so personal. Every time I walked past an alley, I half expected to hear them again, calling my name from the shadows. I told a few friends about the experience, but they brushed it off as stress or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it had been something more. I started avoiding alleys altogether, even in broad daylight. The fear of hearing those whispers again was too strong, too chilling to ignore. But no matter how much I tried to put it out of my mind, memory lingered, a haunting presence that refused to let go. Felt like the whispers had left a mark on me, a connection that I couldn't sever. And every time I found myself alone in a quiet place, I couldn't help but listen for them, half expecting to hear my name whispered in the dark. Then one night, as I walked home through a different part of the city, I heard it again. Faint whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. My heart skipped a beat and I froze in place, straining to listen. But the whisper faded away, leaving only the sound of the city around me. I hurried home, the fear gnawing at me like a persistent itch. The whispers were back, and this time I knew they wouldn't let me go so easily. The experience has changed the way I see the city. What was once familiar and comforting has become a maze of shadows and secrets, filled with whispers that only I can hear. The alley may be far behind me, but its haunting presence lingers, a chilling reminder that some things are better left unexplored. New Orleans has always had a reputation for being haunted, and I've never been one to believe in ghosts. But that night, as I walked through one of the city's oldest neighborhoods, I began to question everything. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet. The fog rolling in from the river and casting an eerie glow on the old, weathered buildings. I had stayed out later than usual, enjoying the music and energy of the city. But now, with the streets deserted, I felt a strange unease creeping in. As I turned a corner, I saw him. A man dressed in vintage clothing, like something out of the early 1900s, standing on the corner as if he were waiting for someone. He looked lost, eyes scanning the street, and something about him seemed out of place. I hesitated, wondering if I should approach him or keep walking. Before I could decide, turned and looked right at me. His gaze was intense, almost pleading, and I felt a strange compulsion to help him. I walked over, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, and asked if he was all right. He nodded, but his eyes told a different story. There was a sadness there. A deep, haunting sorrow seemed to hang around him like a shroud. He told me he was looking for someone, a woman he had lost a long time ago. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and it carried the weight of years of longing and regret. I asked if I could help, but before I could say anything else, he simply vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, leaving nothing behind but the chill in the air. I stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't possible. People don't just disappear like that. I looked around, expecting to see him down the street or turning a corner. The street was empty. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just encountered something or someone far beyond the realm of the living. I hurried home, the weight of the encounter pressing down on me. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, about the sadness in his eyes, and the way he had vanished without a trace. It was like something out of a ghost story. Kind people tell around campfires to scare each other. But this was real. It happened to me, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed paths with a spirit that night. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn back to that street, hoping to catch another glimpse of the man. But no matter how many times I walked through that neighborhood, I never saw him again. The streets were just as quiet, fog just as thick. The ghostly presence was gone. Still, the memory lingered, haunting me in ways I never thought possible. I started to research the area, trying to find any information about a man who might have lived there long ago. But I found nothing. No record of anyone who matched his description. Then, one evening, as I was reading through an old book about the city's history, I stumbled across a story. It was about a man who had lost his fiancée in a tragic accident over a century ago. He had searched for her every night, wandering the streets in his vintage clothing, hoping to find her again. The story was eerily similar to what I had experienced, down to the description of the man and the corner where I had seen him. My blood ran cold as I realized that I had encountered the ghost of a man who had been searching for his lost love for over 100 years. The experience has left me forever changed. I no longer walk through the streets of New Orleans without a sense of wonder and a little bit of fear. The city is full of history, full of stories, and some of those stories are far from over. The man I saw that night may have been a ghost, but his longing, his sorrow, was all too real. And every time I pass that corner, I can't help but wonder if he's still there, waiting for someone who will never return. The encounter has left me with a deeper respect for the mysteries of the world, a haunting reminder that some things are beyond explanation. And every now and then, when the fog rolls in and the streets grow quiet, I think of that man and hope that, wherever he is, he's finally found peace. Paris at night is a city of romance and beauty, but that evening, as I walked down a quiet street, felt more like a city of shadows. The narrow lanes, usually filled with life, were eerily empty, the distant hum of the city barely audible. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows on the cobblestones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was that unsettling sensation of being watched, of eyes following your every move. But when you turn around, there's nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the empty street and the late hour were playing tricks on me. But as I continued walking, the feeling grew stronger, like a weight pressing down on me. I quickened my pace, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. But then, just as I reached the end of the street, I heard it. Breathing. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably close. My heart skipped a beat and I stopped in my tracks, turning around to find the source. But the street was empty, just as before. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The breathing had been so close, as if someone was right behind me. There was no one. The silence pressed in on me, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should keep moving, get to somewhere with more people. My legs felt like lead. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any sign of life, but all I heard was the eerie quiet of the night. Finally, I forced myself to start walking again, faster this time. The breathing had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. It was as if someone or something was following me, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. But every time I turned around, the street remained empty, haunting void that seemed to stretch on forever. As I neared my apartment, the unease reached a fever pitch. I could feel eyes on me, cold and relentless. They were boring into the back of my head. I fumbled for my keys, desperate to get inside and escape whatever was out there. Just as I reached the door, I saw it. Fleeting shadow at the edge of my vision. It was there for only a second, but it was enough to send a wave of terror crashing over me. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. The safety of my apartment was a relief. Fear lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that the unseen watcher was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to get closer. I tried to distract myself, push the experience out of my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, felt those eyes watching me. Sleep became difficult, the nights filled with unsettling dreams that left me more exhausted than before. Days passed, and I began to avoid that street, taking longer routes to avoid the place where I had felt so exposed. But no matter where I went, feeling followed me. It was as if the unseen watcher had latched onto me, a ghostly presence that wouldn't let go. Even in crowded places, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching me, hidden just out of sight. The fear had burrowed deep into my mind, constant companion that I couldn't escape. One evening, as I sat in my apartment trying to unwind, I heard it again. Breathing. This time, it was right outside my window, soft and steady, like someone was standing just inches away. My heart raced, and I froze, listening in disbelief. I wanted to look, to see if someone was really there, but fear rooted me in place. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity before it finally stopped, leaving me in a deafening silence. Never saw the watcher, never found out who or what had been following me that night. But the experience left a scar, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones you can't see. Even now, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, listening for that soft breath in the darkness. And though I may never know the truth, I'll always remember the night I was watched by something unseen. Los Angeles has its share of late-night mysteries, but I never imagined I'd find myself in the middle of one. It was a quiet night, and I had just finished a late shift at work. The streets were mostly deserted as I walked home, the city lights casting a faint glow on the empty roads. I was lost in my thoughts when I noticed it. Cars slowly creeping along behind me. At first, I thought it was just another driver taking their time, but as I crossed the street, the car mirrored my movements. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the car wasn't just passing by, it was following me. Quickened my pace, trying to stay calm. The car kept its distance, never speeding up or slowing down. Eerie silence of the night only heightened my anxiety, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, the car was still there, headlights piercing the darkness like two watchful eyes. Panic began to set in as I tried to think of what to do. I knew I couldn't lead the car back to my apartment, but I also couldn't keep walking aimlessly through the empty streets. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose them, but the car followed, staying just far enough away to keep me on edge. My heart pounded in my chest as I considered my options, but every idea seemed too risky. The city, once so familiar, now felt like a maze with no safe way out. I decided to make a run for it, darting through an alleyway and hoping the car wouldn't be able to follow. But as I emerged on the other side, I saw the car waiting for me at the corner. It was as if they knew exactly where I would go. My pulse raced, and I took off again, weaving through the streets in a desperate attempt to shake them off. The car stayed close, its engine a low, sinister growl in the night. As I turned onto another street, I spotted a convenience store up ahead, its neon sign glowing like a beacon. I sprinted toward it, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I burst through the door, the bell above it jingling loudly, and rushed to the counter, trying to catch my breath. The cashier looked at me with a mix of concern and confusion, but I didn't have time to explain. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the car parked outside, but it was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Couldn't shake the feeling that the car was still out there, waiting for me to leave the safety of the store. I stayed inside for as long as I could, pretending to browse the aisles, but eventually, I knew I had to leave. The streets were eerily quiet as I stepped outside, my eyes scanning every corner for any sign of the car. The fear gnawed at me, but the street was empty. Maybe they had given up, or maybe they were just biding their time. The walk home was a blur of paranoia and fear. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting the car to reappear at any moment. But it never did. When I finally reached my apartment, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and collapsing on the couch, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. In the days that followed, the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of that car, its headlights stalking me through the dark streets. I began to change my routine, taking different routes home, always on the lookout for any sign of the car. But no matter where I went, fear followed me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. It was as if the city itself become a trap, with danger lurking around every corner. Then one evening, as I walked home from work, I saw it again. A car, parked at the end of the street, its engine idling. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place, staring at it. But this time, I didn't run. I stood my ground, waiting to see what would happen. After what felt like an eternity, the car slowly drove away, disappearing into the night. I watched it go, my heart pounding, knowing that this might not be the last time I encountered it. The experience has left me constantly on edge, always wary of the shadows that lurk in the night. The memory of that midnight chase still haunts me, a chilling reminder that some dangers can't be outrun. And every time I see a car creeping along the street, I can't help but wonder if it's them, waiting for the right moment to chase me again. It was a typical late night in the city, and I was walking home, the streets unusually quiet for this time. The shop windows along the way reflected the empty streets and the occasional car passing by, their displays lit up with dim lights. As I passed by one particular shop window, something caught my eye, a reflection that didn't quite match my movements. I paused, staring at the glass, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In the reflection, I saw myself standing still, just as I was. But then, as I looked closer, I noticed that my reflection's eyes weren't focused on me. They were looking over my shoulder. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned around, expecting to see someone or something standing behind me. The street was empty, just as it had been moments before. I glanced back at the window, and my reflection was now perfectly normal, mirroring my movements once more. I shook my head, trying to brush off the unease that had settled over me. It had to be a trick of the light, I told myself, an optical illusion caused by the glass. But as I continued walking, I couldn't resist the urge to glance at the reflections in the other windows. That's when I saw it again. This time, my reflection lingered behind, not quite matching my pace. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second delay, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I stopped again, staring into the glass, willing my reflection to catch up. But instead of moving with me, it seemed to have a life of its own. My reflection's face twisted into a slight smirk, something I hadn't done. Panic welled up inside me, and I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. Reflections didn't just move on their own. I was trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I hurried down the street, I avoided looking at any more windows, afraid of what I might see. Curiosity got the better of me, and when I reached another shop window, I stole a quick glance. My reflection was there, but this time it was different. It wasn't just lagging behind, it was watching me, its eyes following my every move with a chilling intensity. It felt like my reflection was no longer a simple image in the glass, but something more sinister, something that was aware of me. Desperate to escape, I broke into a run, trying to put as much distance between myself and the windows as possible. But even as I fled, I couldn't shake the feeling that my reflection was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to break free. When I finally reached my apartment, I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me and avoiding every reflective surface on my way to my room. The safety of my apartment brought little comfort. Every mirror, every window seemed like a potential threat, a gateway for my reflection to step through. Covered the mirrors, closed the blinds, and tried to push the experience out of my mind. But that night, as I lay in bed, I didn't sleep. My thoughts kept drifting back to that haunting reflection, its eyes boring into me as if it was trying to find a way out. In the days that followed, I became increasingly paranoid. I avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces as much as possible, terrified of what I might see. The memory of that night haunted me, a constant reminder that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. I even considered getting rid of all the mirrors in my apartment, but I knew that wouldn't solve the problem. The reflection wasn't confined to any one mirror. It was following me, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Then, one evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I made the mistake of looking into the bathroom mirror. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, my reflection smirking at me again. This time, the reflection didn't just mimic my movements. It leaned closer to the glass, as if trying to push through, its eyes filled with a sinister glee. I stumbled back, the toothbrush falling from my hand, and quickly turned away, my heart racing. I haven't looked into a mirror since that night. I can't bring myself to face whatever is lurking on the other side. The experience has left me shaken, a chilling reminder that some things are better left unseen. And every time I catch a glimpse of my reflection in a window or a shiny surface, I can't help but wonder if it's still watching me, waiting for the moment when it finally breaks free. Chicago's suburban neighborhoods are usually quiet at night, kind of quiet that feels safe, comforting. But that night, as I walked home, something felt off. The streets were empty, the houses dark, and the only sound was the soft crunch of my footsteps on the pavement. It was late, and I was eager to get home, but as I turned onto my street, I noticed a car parked at the curb, engine idling. There was nothing unusual about a parked car, but this one felt different. The headlights were off, but the engine purred softly, like a predator waiting to pounce. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a neighbor, maybe someone waiting to pick up a friend. But as I walked past the car, I felt a pair of eyes on me. The windows were tinted, and I couldn't see inside, but I knew someone was watching me. I glanced over, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver, but all I saw was a shadowy figure sitting in the driver's seat, unmoving. Chill ran down my spine. I quickened my pace, eager to get away from the unsettling presence. The car didn't move as I walked by. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I resisted the urge to turn around, knowing that if I did, I might see something I didn't want to see. My heart raced as I approached my house, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my keys. I finally managed to unlock the door and slipped inside, shutting it behind me with a shaky sigh of relief. But the unease didn't fade. I couldn't stop thinking about the car, about the figure inside who had been watching me so intently. I peeked through the blinds, expecting to see the car still parked at the curb, but to my surprise, it was gone. The street was empty again, as if the car had never been there. My pulse quickened, and I scanned the street, searching for any sign of it. There was nothing. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next night, I hesitated before heading home. I took a different route, hoping to avoid any chance of encountering the car again. But as I rounded the corner onto my street, there it was, parked in the same spot, engine quietly idling. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place, staring at the car. The figure inside hadn't moved, hadn't turned to look at me, but I could feel their eyes on me just as before. A wave of dread washed over me, and I forced myself to keep walking. My steps hurried and unsteady. This time, I didn't look back. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, and tried to calm my racing heart. But the fear gnawed at me, constant, chilling presence that I couldn't escape. I kept telling myself that it was just a car, just a person minding their own business. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was too strong to ignore. It was as if the car had a life of its own, a sinister intent that I couldn't quite put into words. The nights that followed were filled with the same routine. Walking home, spotting the car, feeling those eyes on me, and rushing inside. Each time the car was there, waiting, always in the same spot, always watching. And each time, it disappeared as soon as I was safely inside. It became a twisted game, one that left me paranoid and exhausted, always wondering what would happen next. Then, one night, the car wasn't there. I felt a brief moment of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a new kind of fear. Where had it gone? Was it waiting for me somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't see? I hurried home, my mind racing with possibilities, and when I got inside, I checked every window, every door, making sure everything was locked. But the street was empty, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to relax. But just as I was about to go to bed, I heard it, the sound of an engine idling outside. My heart sank, and I slowly approached the window, dreading what I would see. There it was, parked right outside my house. Engine running quietly. This time I couldn't see inside. The windows were completely black, and the figure inside was nothing more than a shadow. A cold wave of terror washed over me, and I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night. The car stayed there, its engine running until the early hours of the morning. When I finally gathered the courage to look outside again, it was gone. The fear remained, haunting present, that I couldn't shake. The experience left me forever wary, always scanning the streets for that car, always wondering when it might return. Tokyo is a city that never truly sleeps, but there are moments when the hustle and bustle quiets down, and the city feels almost peaceful. It was late, and I was walking home after a long day. The streets were mostly empty, and the neon lights cast a soft glow on the pavement. As I passed by a small playground nestled between the buildings, I heard it, a faint sound of children laughing. It was so unexpected that I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The playground was dark and deserted, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. But the laughter continued, echoing softly through the night air. It was a joyful sound, the kind you'd expect to hear on a sunny afternoon, not in the dead of night. A chill crept up my spine as I realized that there were no children in sight, no one who could be making that sound. Eerie contrast between the empty playground and the cheerful laughter left me feeling unsettled. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, or perhaps the sound was coming from a nearby building. But as I took a step closer to the playground, the laughter abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the city itself had been holding its breath. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, and I quickly decided it was best to keep moving. As I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The quiet of the night felt oppressive, and every shadow seemed to stretch out, reaching for me. I glanced back at the playground, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing there, but it was just as empty as before. The swings were still now, as if whatever had been there had vanished into the night. For the next few days, the memory of that laughter haunted me. I avoided the playground, taking different routes home, but the sound lingered in my mind. It wasn't just the laughter itself, it was the timing, the way it had appeared out of nowhere and stopped just as suddenly. It felt as though the playground was trying to tell me something, or perhaps warn me. But I couldn't figure out what. Then, one evening, curiosity got the better of me. I found myself walking past the playground again, my steps slowing as I approached. The night was quiet, the city's usual noise reduced to a distant hum. I stopped in front of the playground, staring at the empty swings. For a moment, everything was still. And then, just as before, the laughter started up again, faint and distant, like it was coming from another world. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked right up to the swings, searching for any sign of life. But the playground was empty, the laughter echoing around me with no clear source. The swings began to move, slowly at first, and then with more force, as if invisible hands were pushing them. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stepped back, eerie scene sending a wave of fear through me. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I turned and hurried away, the laughter following me down the street until it faded into the night. The experience left me shaken, a chilling reminder that some places hold on to the past in ways we can't understand. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be walking past that playground again. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. But every now and then, late at night, I would hear that laughter in the distance, faint and haunting. It was as if the playground was calling to me, trying to draw me back. But I resisted, knowing that some mysteries are better left unsolved. And every time I hear that eerie sound, I remind myself that there are places in this city where the past refuses to let go. The experience has left me with a deeper sense of caution, a haunting awareness that not everything in the city is as it seems. And though I've moved on from that night, the memory of the silent playground lingers, chilling reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows of the city. Sydney's streets are usually well lit, the bright glow of streetlights providing a sense of security even late at night. But that evening, as I walked home through a quiet, dimly lit street, I noticed something strange. The streetlights, one by one, began to flicker and go out behind me. It started with the one farthest away, the light blinking out in a brief flash of darkness. At first, I thought it was just a faulty bulb. Then, the next light went out, and then the one after that. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the darkness was creeping closer, following me. I quickened my pace, trying to stay ahead of the encroaching shadows. The lights continued to fail, each one plunging the street further into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the moment when the last one would go out. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence, that the lights were simply malfunctioning, but the timing was too perfect, too deliberate. Every time I took a step, another light would flicker and die, leaving me with less and less of the comforting glow. The night seemed to close in around me, the darkness thick and oppressive, as if it had a life of its own. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, the only sound in the eerie quiet. As I reached the middle of the street, only a few lights remained, casting long shadows that stretched out like fingers. I glanced behind me, expecting to see something or someone emerging from the darkness. The street was empty. The only movement, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Still, the sense of dread grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was waiting for the moment when the final light would go out. I broke into a run, my footsteps pounding against the pavement as I hurried toward the brighter, more populated streets ahead. But the lights continued to fail, one by one, until only a single lamp remained, its glow weak and flickering. I reached the end of the street just as the last light went out, plunging everything into darkness. For a moment, I stood frozen, my breath coming in short gasps as I strained to see through the inky blackness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadowy figure barely visible in the darkness, standing where the last light had been. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, my mind racing with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and menacing. I turned and fled, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides as if it were alive, trying to swallow me whole. When I finally reached the main road, the lights were bright and steady, and the sound of traffic filled the air. But the fear didn't fade. I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure, the way it had seemed to appear out of nowhere, waiting in the darkness. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following me. The street behind me was empty, the lights back on as if nothing had happened. In the days that followed, I avoided that street altogether, taking longer routes to avoid the place where the lights had failed. But the memory of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the darkness that had chased me down the street. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew it was more than just a malfunction. Something had been there, lurking in the shadows, and it wasn't just the lights that had disappeared. Then, one evening, as I was walking home, I noticed the streetlights flickering again. This time, it was on a different street. The pattern was the same. One by one, the lights went out, darkness creeping closer. My heart raced, and I hurried home, fear gnawing at me like a persistent itch. The lights had returned, but the memory of that shadowy figure remained, haunting presence that I couldn't escape. The experience has left me forever wary of the darkness, chilling reminder that some things are better left in the light. And every time I see a streetlight flicker, I can't help but wonder if it's starting again, if the darkness is waiting for another chance to close in. Berlin's streets were quiet as I waited for the late-night bus, the air crisp and cool. The fog had rolled in, giving the city a dreamlike quality. I stood at the bus stop, the only one around, the dim light from the street lamp casting long shadows. The city seemed to be holding its breath, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an eerie silence. I checked my watch, impatiently waiting for the bus to arrive, fog thickening with every passing minute. Finally, the bus appeared out of the mist, its headlights cutting through the fog like ghostly eyes. Pulled up to the stop with a soft hiss, and the door creaked open. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, gave me a nod as I stepped on board. But something about his expression unsettled me. Blankness in his eyes, as if he wasn't really seeing me. I hesitated for a moment, but the lateness of the hour pushed me forward. I found a seat near the middle of the bus, fog outside swirling around the windows like a living thing. As the bus started moving, I glanced around, expecting to see a few other late-night travelers. The seats were all occupied by passengers who sat unnervingly still, their faces turned forward, blank and expressionless. No one spoke, no one moved. They all stared ahead, their eyes empty, lifeless. Chill ran down my spine as I realized that something was terribly wrong. These weren't just tired commuters. They looked more like statues, frozen in time. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that the fog and the late hour were playing tricks on my mind. But the silence was deafening, and the eerie stillness of the passengers was impossible to ignore. I shifted in my seat, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver in the rearview mirror, but his face was obscured by the fog that had somehow seeped inside the bus. The windows were fogged up too, making it impossible to see where we were going. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The bus seemed to glide through the fog, the city outside disappearing into the mist. I began to feel a growing sense of dread, fear that I couldn't quite place. Where were we? How long had we been driving? I checked my watch again, but the hands had stopped, frozen at the moment I had boarded the bus. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I had to get off, to escape whatever strange nightmare I had stumbled into. I stood up, intending to ask the driver where we were, but as I approached the front of the bus, the passengers turned their heads in unison, their blank eyes locking onto me. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes, those eyes, they weren't just empty, they were hollow, like they had seen something far beyond this world. My stomach twisted in fear as I realized that whatever they had seen, they wanted me to see it too. Desperate to get out, I hurried to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The driver stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, as if he were driving through a storm. I pounded on the door, shouting for him to stop. He didn't respond. The fog outside had thickened, enveloping the bus in a cocoon of white. I could no longer see the city streets or any familiar landmarks. It was as if the bus had entered another world, one where time and place no longer mattered. Finally, the bus slowed to a stop. The door creaked open, and I rushed out, stumbling onto the pavement. The fog was still thick, but I could see faint lights in the distance, a street lamp, a building. I turned back to look at the bus, but it was already pulling away, disappearing into the mist. As it vanished, I caught a glimpse of the passengers, still staring straight ahead, their lifeless eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The bus was gone, and the street was empty. The fog began to lift, revealing the familiar sights of the city around me. But I knew that what I had experienced wasn't just a dream. The vanishing bus, the lifeless passengers, it was real, and it left me with a haunting sense of dread that I couldn't shake. In the days that followed, I avoided the late-night buses, opting for other ways to get home. But the memory of that night haunted me, a chilling reminder that some journeys take you to places you were never meant to go. And every time I see a bus emerge from the fog, I can't help but wonder if it's the same one, waiting to take its next passenger on a journey into the unknown. Miami is known for its vibrant nightlife, with music and laughter filling the streets, even in the early hours of the morning. But that night, as I walked home from a party, the city seemed strangely quiet. The usual sounds of cars, chatter, and distant music had all faded away, placed by an eerie silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. It was unsettling, as if the city had been muted, leaving only the sound of my footsteps echoing on the pavement. At first, I tried to enjoy the quiet, telling myself it was a welcome break from the usual noise. The silence felt unnatural, almost oppressive, as if something had drained the life out of the city. I quickened my pace, eager to get home, but the silence followed me, clinging to me like a shadow. The further I walked, the more intense it became, until it felt like the whole world had gone silent, leaving me utterly alone. As I rounded a corner, I noticed something strange. The streetlights seemed dimmer, their light barely penetrating the darkness. The buildings, usually vibrant with neon signs and flashing lights, were now just dark silhouettes against the night sky. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that it wasn't just the noise that had disappeared. Everything felt muted, as if the city itself was fading away. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the silence was relentless, pressing in on me from all sides. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence, something tangible and menacing that seemed to be following me. My heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though there was no one around. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently, hoping to hear something, anything, that would break the oppressive silence. But there was nothing. No cars, no voices, no distant music. Just the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty street for any sign of movement, but it was as if the entire city had frozen in time. The silence was complete, total, and it filled me with a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. Desperate to escape, I started walking again, faster this time, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. The silence followed me, growing heavier with each step, until it felt like I was walking through a thick, invisible fog. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew that no matter how fast I went, the silence would keep up, always one step behind. It was as if the city itself was stalking me, waiting for the right moment to close in. As I neared my apartment building, the silence reached a fever pitch. It was so intense that it seemed to vibrate in my ears, a deafening nothingness that threatened to swallow me whole. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking, and quickly let myself inside, slamming the door behind me. But even within the safety of my apartment, the silence persisted. The usual hum of appliances, the distant sounds of the city, All of it was gone, laced by that suffocating quiet. I sat down, trying to catch my breath. The silence pressed in on me from all sides, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I tried turning on the TV, the radio, anything to break the silence, but nothing worked. The sound wouldn't come, and the oppressive stillness remained. It was then that I realized the silence wasn't just outside. It was inside me too, seeping into every corner of my mind. The next morning, the city was back to normal, the usual sounds and sights returning as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget the silence. The way it had followed me, suffocated me. It lingered in my thoughts, a haunting reminder that some things are more terrifying than noise. Even now, whenever the city goes quiet, I can't help but listen for that silence. That creeping, following stillness that seems to be waiting for the right moment to turn. The experience has left me forever wary of the quiet moments, a chilling reminder that silence can be just as menacing, any sound. And every time the city falls silent, even for a moment, I can't help but feel that it's not really gone, that it's just waiting, biding its time before it follows me again. Seattle is known for its rain, and that night was no different. The steady drizzle created a rhythm as it pattered on the streets, the sound soothing and familiar. I had always found comfort in the rain. That evening, as I walked home, something felt off. The rain wasn't just falling, it seemed to be enveloping the city in a thick, suffocating blanket. The usual noises of the city were muted, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the rooftops and splashing on the pavement. I pulled my coat tighter around me and quickened my pace, eager to escape the dampness. But as I walked, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the streetlights, the way they reflected off the wet pavement. But then the shadow moved. Deliberately, purposefully. It wasn't just a shadow. It was following me. I turned to get a better look, but all I saw was the rain-soaked street, empty and still. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest, telling myself it was just my imagination. But every time I glanced to the side, there it was again, the shadow, growing larger with each step I took. It stayed just out of reach, blending into the darkness, but always present, always looming. The rain seemed to intensify, each drop hitting the pavement like a drumbeat, echoing the pounding of my heart. The streetlights flickered as I passed by, casting strange, distorted reflections in the puddles that dotted the sidewalk. The shadow moved with me, never too close, but never far behind. I couldn't make out any details, but it felt like it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. My pulse quickened, and I fought the urge to break into a run. I didn't want to show it that I was afraid, even though fear had already taken hold of me. As I neared a familiar intersection, the shadow seemed to grow bolder, inching closer with every step. The rain pounded harder, soaking through my coat and making it difficult to see. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to maintain my composure. The sense of dread was overwhelming. I turned onto a side street, hoping to lose whatever was following me. The shadow followed, relentless in its pursuit. The rain was now coming down in sheets, and I could barely make out the buildings around me. The world had shrunk to the space between me and the shadow, the rest of the city fading into a blur of water and darkness. My footsteps splashed loudly in the puddles, but the shadow's movements were silent, like a predator stalking its prey. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was getting closer, that it was no longer content to stay in the background. Desperate to escape, I made a sharp turn into an alleyway, hoping to find shelter from the rain. But as I stepped into the narrow space, I realized my mistake. The alley was a dead end, and the shadow had followed me in. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. It wasn't just a shadow. It had form, substance, a dark figure that seemed to shift and change with the rain. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were empty voids, drawing me in with a terrifying intensity. For a moment, I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The shadow loomed over me, its presence suffocating. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it dissipated into the rain, vanishing as if it had never been there. The alley was empty once more, the only sound the steady drip of water from the rooftops. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I hurried home, the rain still falling, but the shadow was gone. The safety of my apartment was a relief, but the memory of that night clung to me like the dampness in my clothes. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow, the way it had seemed so real, so menacing. Even now, when the rain starts to fall, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure lurking in the downpour. The experience has left me forever wary of the rain. Chilling reminder, some shadows are more than just tricks of the light. Every time the sky darkens and the rain begins to fall, I can't shake the feeling that the shadow might return, waiting for the right moment to step out of the rain and into my life again. San Francisco's iconic fog was thick that night, rolling in from the bay and swallowing everything in its path. I found myself walking across a bridge, the mist so dense that the city lights were barely visible in the distance. The bridge was quiet, the usual sounds of traffic muffled by the fog. I could hear only the faint lapping of water against the supports below and the occasional distant cry of a seagull. The eerie stillness of the night pressed in on me, making me feel like I was the only person in the world. As I walked further along the bridge, the fog seemed to grow thicker, wrapping itself around me like a cold, damp blanket. The air was heavy with moisture, and every breath felt labored. I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had begun to creep in. That's when I heard it, a faint cry for help, barely audible above the sound of the water. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen, but the fog muffled the sound, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. The cry came again, louder this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a desperate, pleading sound, echoing through the mist like a haunting melody. I looked around, but the bridge was empty, the thick fog obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The cry for help grew more frantic, and I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I began to walk toward the sound, my footsteps echoing in the silence, each step taking me deeper into the fog. As I moved closer, cries seemed to multiply, overlapping and intertwining, until it felt like there were dozens of voices calling out from the mist. The sound was disorienting, coming from all directions at once. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched the fog for any sign of life, but all I could see were the dim outlines of the bridge's structure, fading into the mist. The voices were close now, so close that I could almost feel their desperation. Suddenly, fog parted just enough for me to see them, ghostly figures, barely visible in the thick mist. They were scattered along the bridge, their forms translucent and wavering, as if they were made of the fog itself. Their faces were etched with sorrow and fear, their eyes pleading for help. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. These weren't just people, they were something else. Something not quite of this world. The figures moved slowly, drifting toward me with an almost dreamlike quality. Their voices filled the air, chorus of cries and whispers that sent a wave of dread crashing over me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from them as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the middle of the bridge with these lost souls. They reached out to me, their hands grasping at the air, as if they were trying to pull me into the fog with them. In a moment of sheer panic, I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I fled from the ghostly figures. The cries for help followed me, growing louder and more desperate with each step I took. Fog seemed to close in around me, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I could feel the presence of the lost souls behind me, their cold breath on the back of my neck, their hands just inches away. Finally, I reached the end of the bridge, the fog thinning as I stumbled onto solid ground. The cries faded into the distance, replaced by the familiar sounds of the city. I looked back, half expecting to see the ghostly figures emerging from the mist. The bridge was empty, the fog now just a harmless veil over the bay. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. There was no logical explanation. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the bridge, about the lost souls I had encountered in the fog. I started to research the area, trying to find any clues about what I had experienced. I discovered that the bridge had a dark history. Many people had lost their lives there over the years, their bodies claimed by the cold waters below. It was said that their spirits still haunted the bridge, searching for peace that they would never find. The experience has left me with a lingering sense of unease. I no longer walk across that bridge, especially not at night. The memory of those lost souls, their haunting cries for help, is too fresh, too real. And every time I see the fog rolling in from the bay, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone to hear their pleas and guide them to the peace they so desperately seek. Moscow's winters are long and cold, and that night, the chill seemed to seep into my bones as I walked through the old apartment building where I lived. The hallways were dimly lit, walls stained with years of neglect. The building had a reputation for being eerie, and I had always tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that clung to the corridors. That night, it was impossible to shake. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as I made my way down the long, narrow corridor that led to my apartment. As I walked, the sound of faint footsteps echoed behind me. At first, I thought it was just one of the other tenants, someone heading to their own apartment. But when I glanced over my shoulder, the hallway was empty. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. Footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, as if someone was right behind me, matching my every step. I stopped and turned around again, expecting to see someone standing there, but the corridor remained empty. The sound of the footsteps stopped as well, leaving only the howling wind and the creaking of the old building. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The footsteps had felt too real, too deliberate, as if someone or something was following me. I hurried down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I could feel the weight of the building pressing down on me, cold air seeping through the cracks in the walls. As I neared my apartment, the footsteps returned, louder this time, almost as if they were running to catch up with me. My pulse quickened, and I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get inside before whatever was behind me could reach me. Just as I unlocked the door, I heard a low whisper, faint and unintelligible but undeniably there. I froze, key halfway in the lock, and slowly turned around. The corridor was still empty, but the air felt heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't see. The whisper came again, closer this time, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Panic surged through me, and I threw open the door, rushing inside and slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, my heart racing, trying to catch my breath. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The fear lingered, a chilling presence that refused to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me inside, that the whispers and footsteps weren't just confined to the corridor. The sense of being watched, of not being alone, was overwhelming. In the days that followed, creepy corridor haunted my thoughts. Every time I stepped outside my apartment, I found myself glancing down the hallway, half expecting to see something, or someone waiting for me. Footsteps and whispers never returned, but the memory of that night lingered. Constant reminder of the unseen presence that had followed me home. The old building, once just a place to live, had become a place of fear, its dark corners and long corridors hiding secrets that I didn't want to uncover. Then, one evening, as I was walking down the hallway again, I heard it, faint sound of footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned around. But once again, the corridor was empty. The lights flickered overhead, and I felt the cold breath on my neck, just like before. This time, I didn't wait to see what would happen. I ran down the hallway, not stopping until I was safely inside my apartment, the door locked tightly behind me. The experience has left me with a deep sense of unease. I no longer feel safe in my own home, and the creepy corridor that once led to my sanctuary has become a place of dread. Footsteps, the whispers, they may be gone. The fear remains, haunting reminder that some places are filled with more than just shadows. Venice at night is a city of secrets. Its narrow streets and canals shrouded in shadows. That evening, as I wandered through the labyrinth of ancient buildings, the city seemed quieter than usual, almost too quiet. The air was thick with the scent of the sea, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the stone walls. The narrow streets twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the heart of the city, away from the more familiar paths. It wasn't long before I realized that I had lost my way. As I stood at a crossroads, trying to get my bearings, I heard it. Faint whisper, like the sound of someone speaking just behind me. I turned around, expecting to see someone there. But the street was empty, the shadows stretching out like fingers toward me. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to listen, trying to make out the words, but they were too soft, too garbled to understand. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe the sound of the water echoing off the buildings. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to tell me something. They seemed to be coming from every direction, bouncing off the walls and filling the narrow street with a chorus of voices. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the whispers weren't just random noises. They were calling my name. I began to walk again, faster this time, hoping to escape the eerie sound. But the whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. They seemed to wrap around me, clinging to me like the fog that sometimes rolls in from the sea. My footsteps echoed off the stone, but they couldn't drown out the voices. They were all around me, urging me to turn back, to leave before it was too late. The ancient buildings loomed over me, their facades worn and weathered by centuries of history. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, judging me. I turned down another narrow alley, hoping to find my way back to the main streets, but the whispers only grew louder, more frantic. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. The voices were clearer now, and though I couldn't understand their words, I could feel their urgency, their desperation. It was as if the city itself was trying to warn me of something I couldn't see. Panic began to set in and I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in the narrow alley. No matter how fast I walked, the whispers kept pace with me, never fading, never ceasing. The ancient walls seemed to pulse with the sound, as if they were alive, breathing their warnings into the night. My heart raced, and I could feel the fear building inside me, cold knot in my stomach that I couldn't ignore. Finally, I reached a small square, the whispers fading slightly as I stepped into the open space. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The sense of unease remained. The buildings around the square were old, their windows dark and empty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, like a distant echo that refused to die. I didn't stay in the square for long. The sense of dread was too strong, too palpable. I quickly found a familiar street and hurried back toward the more populated areas of the city, the whispers finally fading into the background. But the experience left me shaken, a haunting reminder that Venice is a city filled with more than just history. Its walls hold secrets, and sometimes those secrets want to be heard. In the days that followed, I couldn't forget the whispers. They lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of that eerie night. Even now, when I walk through the narrow streets of Venice, I can't help but listen for them, half expecting to hear my name called out from the shadows. The city is full of mysteries, and I know that some of them are better left undisturbed. But the memory of the whispering walls stays with me. A chilling reminder that Venice is a place where the past is never truly silent. Barcelona at night has a certain magic to it. The streets illuminated by warm, golden light, and the echoes of laughter and conversation filling the air. That evening, I found myself walking through the city's narrow, winding streets, enjoying the quiet that comes when most of the tourists have retired for the night. The city felt peaceful, almost serene, as I wandered aimlessly, letting the beauty of the architecture and the charm of the old streets guide my way. As I turned a corner, I noticed a lone pedestrian walking toward me. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about them. Tall figure, dressed in dark clothing, their footsteps echoing softly in the night. I barely paid them any attention as we approached each other, both of us minding our own business. But as we drew nearer, something strange happened. The figure began to fade, as if the light itself was swallowing them up. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, the pedestrian was gone. There was no sign of them anywhere on the street, no sound of footsteps retreating into the distance. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I looked around, expecting to see the figure reappear from behind a building or down another street, but the street was empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, far removed from the eerie stillness that had suddenly enveloped me. My heart began to race as I realized that what I had seen, or not seen, wasn't just a trick of the light. The pedestrian had truly disappeared, and I had no explanation for it. I continued walking, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. But every corner I turned, every empty street I passed, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. The city, once so familiar and comforting, now felt strange and otherworldly, as if I had stepped into a place where the normal rules didn't apply. The warmth of the night had turned cold, and the quiet streets seemed to stretch on endlessly, leading me deeper into the unknown. As I made my way back to a more populated area, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The streets were empty, but the sense of a presence lingered, just out of sight, just beyond my reach. Every shadow seemed to shift and move, and every sound felt amplified, echoing in the stillness. I quickened my pace, eager to escape the eerie sensation that had wrapped itself around me. When I finally reached a busy square, the noise and light were a welcome relief. The sounds of people chatting and laughing brought me back to reality. But the memory of the vanishing pedestrian stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen or how it had made me feel. It was as if the city itself had briefly opened a door to another world, one where people could disappear without a trace. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to that street, hoping to find some explanation for what had happened. But no matter how many times I walked that same path, I never saw the pedestrian again. The street remained quiet, ordinary, with no sign of the strange occurrence that had taken place. Yet, the memory of it haunted me, a chilling reminder that some things defy explanation. The experience has left me with a lingering sense of unease, feeling that the city holds more secrets than I could ever understand. Barcelona's charm and beauty are undeniable, but beneath the surface lies something mysterious, something that occasionally slips through the cracks and reveals itself in the most unexpected ways. And every time I walk those narrow streets at night, I can't help but wonder if I'll see that vanishing pedestrian again, or if I'll be the next one to disappear. London at night is a city of contrasts, vibrant and lively in some places, eerily quiet in others. That night, I was standing on a deserted street, waiting for a taxi after a late shift. The air was cool, and the distant hum of the city provided a comforting background noise. After a few minutes of waiting, I saw the familiar glow of a taxi's headlights cutting through the darkness. Relieved, I waved it down, and it slowly pulled over to the curb. The cab looked ordinary enough, but as I opened the door and climbed inside, a strange feeling washed over me. The driver didn't greet me, didn't ask where I was headed. He just sat there, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. His face was obscured by shadows, and the rearview mirror was angled away from me, making it impossible to see his eyes. I hesitated for a moment, chill running down my spine, but I was too tired to find another ride. I gave him my address, and without a word, he began to drive. Silence in the cab was suffocating. No radio playing in the background, no idle chatter from the driver. Just the soft hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the tires on the wet pavement. I tried to make conversation, asking the driver how his night had been, but he didn't respond. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as if he were holding on for dear life. The longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. Something about the driver felt. As we drove through the city, I noticed that the usual landmarks seemed to blur and fade into the night. Streets felt unfamiliar, like we were heading deeper into a part of the city I had never seen before. The fog outside thickened, wrapping the city in a blanket of mist. My unease grew with every passing minute, but I couldn't bring myself to speak up. The silence in the cab had become oppressive, a weight pressing down on me that I couldn't shake. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer. I asked the driver to pull over, telling him I'd walk the rest of the way, but he didn't acknowledge me, didn't even glance in my direction. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized that he wasn't going to stop. The streets outside were empty, the city lights barely visible through the fog. I reached for the door handle, intending to jump out at the next stoplight. But the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. I pounded on the window, shouting for the driver to stop, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. My heart raced as I fumbled with the door, trying to force it open, but it was no use. The cab continued to glide through the fog, the city outside becoming more and more distorted. It was as if the world was shifting around us, slipping into a place where normal rules didn't apply. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the cab finally slowed down and came to a stop. We were in front of my building. The street looked different, darker, like it had been drained of color. I scrambled out of the cab, my hands shaking as I slammed the door behind me. I turned to pay the driver, but when I looked through the window, the cab was empty. The driver's seat was vacant, as if no one had been there at all. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The cab idled for a moment longer, then drove off into the fog, disappearing into the night without a trace. I stood there, staring after it, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The silence of the night pressed in around me, but it was nothing compared to the oppressive quiet that had filled the cab. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that silent ride. I avoided taxis, opting to walk or take public transportation instead. But no matter how much distance I put between myself and that night, the experience lingered in my mind. The empty streets, fog, the driver who wasn't really there. It was all too vivid, too real. And every time I see a taxi at night, I can't help but wonder if it's the same one, waiting to pick up its next passenger and take them on a journey into the unknown. The experience has left me wary of the city at night, a haunting reminder that some rides take you places you were never meant to go. And every time I hear the soft hum of a taxi's engine in the distance, I can't help but listen for that oppressive silence, that chilling reminder of the ride I'll never forget. Toronto's streets are usually lively, even late at night, but that evening, the city felt unnervingly still. Sidewalks, typically filled with people hurrying to their destinations, were deserted, and the glow from the streetlights seemed to cast an unnatural hue on the empty pavement. I had never seen the city so quiet, and as I walked home, the silence began to feel oppressive. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of my footsteps echoing in the night. As I made my way down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The city, though familiar, seemed to shift and change around me. Every time I glanced back, the street behind me appeared different, as if the buildings had rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. It was a subtle change at first, a sign that seemed out of place, a building that looked unfamiliar. But the further I walked, the more pronounced it became. I tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue, that my mind was playing tricks on me after a long day. But the sense of unease grew stronger with each step, and soon I found myself questioning everything around me. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by strange buildings that loomed over the sidewalk, their windows dark and empty. It was as if the city itself was shifting, trying to trap me in a maze of unfamiliar streets. I picked up my pace, determined to find my way back to a recognizable part of the city. But no matter how far I walked, the streets continued to change, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The sidewalks, once straight and predictable, now seemed to curve and spiral, leading me in circles. The buildings towered over me, their facades cold and unwelcoming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting for me to make a wrong turn. The city felt alive, like it was shifting around me with every step I took. The sidewalk beneath my feet seemed to stretch and contract, as if it were trying to lead me somewhere I didn't want to go. My heart raced as I realized that I was lost, not just in the city, but in something far more sinister. The familiar had become unfamiliar, and I felt a growing sense of dread as I wondered if I would ever find my way out. As I turned another corner, I found myself on a street that I was sure didn't exist. Buildings were old and decrepit, their windows boarded up, and the streetlights flickered ominously. The sidewalk stretched out in front of me, empty and silent, and I knew that I had to keep moving, even though every instinct told me to turn back. But there was no turning back now. The city had changed, and the way home was lost. I walked faster, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The street behind me seemed to shift every time I looked back, as if the city was trying to close in on me. The buildings loomed larger, their shadows stretching across the sidewalk, and I could feel the weight of the city pressing down on me. My breath came in short gasps, and I fought the urge to run, knowing that the city would only twist and change faster if I did. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, I turned a corner and found myself back on a familiar street. The buildings were as they should be, street lights steady and bright. The city had returned to normal, and the oppressive weight lifted from my shoulders. The relief was short-lived. The memory of the shifting streets and the empty sidewalks haunted me, a chilling reminder that the city wasn't always what it seemed. In the days that followed, I avoided that part of town, fearful that the city might try to trap me again. But the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that the city held secrets far beyond my understanding. Every time I walk those streets, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting the buildings to shift and change once more, trapping me in a maze of unfamiliarity. The experience has left me wary of the city at night, a haunting reminder that even the most familiar places can become strange and dangerous in the blink of an eye. And every time I find myself on an empty sidewalk, I can't shake the feeling that the city is waiting, watching, ready to change again. Mexico City at night is a vibrant, chaotic place, filled with life and energy. But that night, as I walked through the bustling streets, something felt different. The usual noise of the city seemed distant, muffled, as if I were moving through a dream. The neon lights reflected off the windows of shops and restaurants, casting strange, distorted images on the glass. I was lost in my thoughts, barely paying attention to my surroundings, when something in one of the reflections caught my eye. It was just a fleeting glimpse at first, figure in the reflection that didn't match what was happening around me. I stopped and stared into the shop window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My reflection was there, as it should be, but there was something else, too. A shadowy figure standing just behind me, its features obscured by the glare of the lights. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the sidewalk was empty. I looked back at the window, and the figure was gone. It was just my reflection now, perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But as I continued walking, I couldn't resist the urge to glance at the reflections in the other windows. That's when I saw it again. The shadowy figure, standing just a few feet behind me, watching my every move. This time, figure lingered in the reflection for a moment longer before disappearing again. I spun around, but once again, the street behind me was empty. Chill ran down my spine as I realized that whatever was following me wasn't confined to the reflections. It was out there, somewhere in the real world, just beyond my sight. I quickened my pace, my heart racing, but every time I passed another window, I couldn't stop myself from looking. The figure was always there, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always watching. Never moved, never changed its posture, but its presence was undeniable. The city around me seemed to fade into the background, the noise and lights becoming a distant hum as my focus narrowed to the reflections in the windows. My footsteps echoed loudly in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The figure was waiting for the right moment to step out of the glass and into reality. I finally reached my apartment, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my keys. I glanced at the building's glass door, dreading what I might see. The figure was there, standing just behind me, closer than ever before. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly turned around, ready to confront whatever was following me. But once again, the sidewalk was empty. The only movement, the flicker of distant lights. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The safety of my apartment did little to calm my nerves. Every reflective surface, every mirror, every window, felt like a potential threat. I covered the mirrors and closed the blinds. The fear lingered, a gnawing presence that refused to leave. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, about the way it had watched me from the reflections, always there but never fully seen. Felt like it was still out there, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. In the days that followed, I avoided looking into any reflective surfaces. I went out of my way to avoid windows and mirrors, fearful of what I might see. But the memory of that night haunted me, constant reminder that something was out there, something that could only be seen in the reflection. Every time I caught a glimpse of myself in a shiny surface, I held my breath, waiting to see if the figure would reappear. The experience has left me with a deep sense of unease, a feeling that the world isn't as solid and predictable as it seems. The reflections that once seemed so ordinary now feel like windows into another reality, one where shadows can follow you, even if you can't see them directly. And every time I pass by a window, I can't help but look, half expecting to see that figure standing there, waiting for me in the glass. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the car. It was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly looked away, hoping that when the lights returned, the figure would be gone. But when the car was illuminated again, the figure was still there, standing motionless, its face obscured by darkness. I wanted to move, to get up and run to the next car, but my body felt frozen, trapped by fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air in the car felt thick with its presence. The train rattled on, the noise of the tracks growing louder, almost deafening. The lights flickered again, plunging the car into darkness, and when they came back on, the figure was closer, only a few seats away. Panic surged through me, and I finally managed to stand, my legs shaking as I stumbled toward the door. The train was still moving, the tunnel outside a blur of shadows. I fumbled with the door, trying to open it, but it was locked. I turned back, my heart racing, and saw that the figure had moved even closer. It was now just a few feet away, its outline clear in the flickering light. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away, pressing myself against the cold metal of the door. The lights flickered one last time, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. The car was empty again, the silence deafening. I stood there, trembling, unsure if what I had seen was real or just a trick of the light. The train continued to speed through the tunnel, and after what felt like an eternity, finally came to a stop. The doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and I stumbled out onto the platform, gasping for air. The station was just as empty as before, but the oppressive silence had lifted. I glanced back at the train, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, but the car was empty. The doors closed, and the train disappeared into the tunnel, leaving me alone on the platform. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. The memory of the figure lingered. Chilling reminder of the dark subway ride I'd never forget. In the days that followed, I avoided the subway whenever I could, choosing other ways to get around the city. But the experience haunted me. Constant reminder that the shadows in the subway held more than just darkness. And every time I hear the distant rumble of a train, I can't help but wonder if that figure is still out there, riding the last train of the night, waiting for someone else to see it. New York's subway system is always bustling, even late at night. That evening, the station felt different. The usual crowds were nowhere to be seen, and the platform was eerily quiet. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the worn tiles. I had taken the subway countless times before, but tonight, as I waited for the last train, a sense of unease settled over me. Silence was heavy, oppressive, as if the city itself had taken a breath and was holding it in. When the train finally arrived, it screeched to a halt with a sound that echoed through the empty station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty car. Normally, I would have welcomed the solitude, but something about the empty train felt wrong. Still, it was late, and I just wanted to get home, so I stepped inside. The doors closed behind me with a soft hiss, and the train lurched forward, plunging into the darkness of the tunnel. The car was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering sporadically as the train rattled along the track. I took a seat near the middle, my eyes scanning the empty rows of seats. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the clatter of the train as it sped through the underground. I tried to relax, telling myself it was just another late-night ride, but the feeling of unease refused to fade. As the train moved deeper into the tunnel, the lights flickered more frequently, casting the car in brief bursts of darkness. Couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was lurking just out of sight. I glanced around. The car was still empty. Yet, in the darkness between the flickers of light, I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. My pulse quickened, and I strained to see through the dim light, but the shadows remained just that. Shadows. Then, as the train rumbled on, I heard it. Faint noise, a soft tapping. It started at one end of the car, growing louder as it moved closer. I turned in my seat, searching for the source, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something or someone was making its way toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the edge of my seat, my eyes darting around the car. But the seats remained empty, and the tapping grew louder, echoing through the silent car. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the car. It was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly looked away, hoping that when the lights returned, the figure would be gone. But when the car was illuminated again, the figure was still there, standing motionless, its face obscured by darkness. I wanted to move, to get up and run to the next car, but my body felt frozen, trapped by fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air in the car felt thick with its presence. The train rattled on, the noise of the tracks growing louder, almost deafening. The lights flickered again, plunging the car into darkness, and when they came back on, the figure was closer, only a few seats away. Panic surged through me, and I finally managed to stand, my legs shaking as I stumbled toward the door. The train was still moving, the tunnel outside a blur of shadows. Fumbled with the door, trying to open it, but it was locked. I turned back, my heart racing, and saw that the figure had moved even closer. It was now just a few feet away, its outline clear in the flickering light. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away, pressing myself against the cold metal of the door. The lights flickered one last time, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. The car was empty again, the silence deafening. I stood there, trembling, unsure if what I had seen was real or just a trick of the light. The train continued to speed through the tunnel, and after what felt like an eternity, it finally came to a stop. The doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and I stumbled out onto the platform, gasping for air. The station was just as empty as before, but the oppressive silence had lifted. I glanced back at the train, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway. The car was empty. The doors closed, and the train disappeared into the tunnel, leaving me alone on the platform. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, but the memory of the figure lingered, a chilling reminder of the dark subway ride I'd never forget. In the days that followed, I avoided the subway whenever I could, choosing other ways to get around the city. But the experience haunted me, a constant reminder that the shadows in the subway held more than just darkness. And every time I hear the distant rumble of a train, I can't help but wonder if that figure is still out there, riding the last train of the night, waiting for someone else to see it. Rome is a city steeped in history, where every corner holds a story, and every street seems to whisper secrets from the past. That night, as I wandered through the ancient city, the streets were quiet, almost unnervingly so. The usual tourists and locals had disappeared, leaving the cobblestone alleys eerily empty. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and the dim streetlights cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, trying to find a shortcut back to my hotel. The city, usually so familiar, now felt like a labyrinth. The narrow streets, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. As I walked deeper into the maze, I noticed an old, crumbling building that hadn't been there before. It stood at the end of a deserted street, windows dark and its facade worn by time. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself drawn toward it. The closer I got, the more I realized that something was wrong. The street seemed too quiet, too still, as if the city itself had turned its back on this place. The building loomed over me, its walls cracked and crumbling, and I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me. It was as if the building was alive, watching me with dark, hollow eyes that had seen too much. I hesitated at the entrance, the door hanging slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the darkness inside. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave this place and never return, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if the building was calling to me, urging me to step inside and uncover the secrets it held. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cold and damp, the smell of mold and decay filling my nostrils. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked deeper into the building, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had been here in decades. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Feeling of being watched. Rome is a city steeped in history, where every corner holds a story, and every street seems to whisper secrets from the past. That night, as I wandered through the ancient city, the streets were quiet, almost unnervingly so. The usual tourists and locals had disappeared, leaving the cobblestone alleys eerily empty. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and the dim streetlights cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, trying to find a shortcut back to my hotel. The city, usually so familiar, now felt like a labyrinth. The narrow streets, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. As I walked deeper into the maze, I noticed an old, crumbling building that hadn't been there before. It stood at the end of a deserted street, windows dark and its facade worn by time. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself drawn toward it. The closer I got, the more I realized that something was wrong. The street seemed too quiet, too still, as if the city itself had turned its back on this place. The building loomed over me, its walls cracked and crumbling, and I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me. It was as if the building was alive, watching me with dark, hollow eyes that had seen too much. I hesitated at the entrance, the door hanging slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the darkness inside. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave this place and never return, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if the building was calling to me, urging me to step inside and uncover the secrets it held. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cold and damp, the smell of mold and decay filling my nostrils. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked deeper into the building, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had been here in decades. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Feeling of being watched. As I explored the building, I began to notice strange things. The rooms seemed to shift and change, their layouts warping in ways that defied logic. Doors that had once been closed were now open, and hallways that should have led to dead ends stretched on into the darkness. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more disoriented I became, until I realized that I was trapped in a nightmarish loop of dark corridors and shifting walls. Panic set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but the building seemed to twist around me, leading me further away from the exit. The shadows grew longer and the air grew colder, until I could see my breath in front of me. I could feel the presence of something else in the building, something that didn't want me to leave. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could hear faint whispers like voices carried on the wind, urging me to stay. Finally, after what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled upon a staircase that hadn't been there before. Desperate for a way out, I climbed the stairs, my footsteps heavy on the worn wood. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding upward in endless spirals. My legs ached, and my breath came in short gasps, but I couldn't stop. I had to find a way out. When I finally reached the top, I found myself in a small, dusty room with a single window. The glass was fogged over, but I could see the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Relief washed over me as I realized that I had found my way out. I rushed to the window, desperate to escape. But when I looked outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The street below was empty, but it wasn't the same street I had entered from. The buildings were different, older, as if I had stepped back in time. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing, and turned to leave the room. But the door had vanished, replaced by a blank wall. I was trapped, the building's dark corridors and shifting walls closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with a cacophony of voices. I knew then that I would never leave this place. The experience has left me with a deep sense of dread, a haunting reminder that some places hold more than just history. The abandoned street, crumbling building, they still linger in my mind, a nightmarish memory that refuses to fade. And every time I wander the streets of Rome, I can't shake the feeling that the city is watching, waiting to pull me back into its dark embrace. Boston's historic streets have always held a certain charm, but that night, as I walked through the dimly lit alleys, the city felt different. The usual vibrancy of the town had faded, leaving the streets unusually quiet. The air was cool, and a slight fog had begun to roll in from the harbor, wrapping the old brick buildings in a thick, eerie mist. I had lost my way while exploring the city, and the maze of unfamiliar streets only seemed to get more confusing as the fog thickened. As I stood at a crossroads, trying to decide which way to go, a man appeared from the fog. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his coat and hat reminiscent of another era. He seemed out of place in the modern city, but his warm smile and polite demeanor put me at ease. "You look lost," he said, his voice calm and soothing. "I know a shortcut if you'd like some help." Grateful for the assistance, I nodded and followed him. He moved with a quiet confidence, his steps sure and deliberate, as if he knew these streets like the back of his hand. As we walked, he pointed out various landmarks, sharing bits of history about the city that I had never heard before. His knowledge was impressive, and I found myself captivated by his stories, which seemed to bring the old city to life. But as we walked deeper into the fog, something began to feel off. The buildings around us seemed to blur and fade, their familiar shapes dissolving into the mist. The streets grew narrower, cobblestones uneven beneath my feet. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The city I thought I knew had changed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had wandered into a place that didn't quite belong. The man continued to lead the way, seemingly unaware of my growing unease. His stories became more cryptic, his words laced with hints of a past long forgotten. The fog thickened, obscuring everything around us, and soon it felt as though we were walking through a ghost town, the rest of the world fading away. I tried to ask him where we were, but his answers were vague, almost as if he didn't want me to know. As we turned down yet another narrow alley, I noticed that the buildings around us had begun to change. They were older now, their facades crumbling, their windows dark and empty. The streets were deserted, the silence oppressive. My heart began to race as I realized that I had no idea where I was or how to get back. The man, who had seemed so friendly and helpful at first, now felt like a stranger, someone I wasn't sure I could trust. Finally, I stopped walking. "I think I'll find my own way from here," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The man turned to face me, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes that made me shiver. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice soft, almost too soft. "You're so close now." I didn't know what he meant by that, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I shook my head and took a step back, determined to leave. He didn't try to stop me. Instead, he simply nodded and pointed down a narrow, darkened street. "Your way home is that way," he said. I hesitated for a moment, then turned and hurried down the street, desperate to escape the strange, dreamlike world I had found myself in. The fog clung to me, thick and suffocating, and I could hear my own footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. But when I reached the end of the street, fog began to lift, and I found myself back in a part of the city I recognized. Relief washed over me as I saw familiar buildings and heard the distant hum of traffic. I glanced back, half expecting to see the man standing there watching me. But the street behind me was empty, fog slowly dissipating. It was as if he had vanished, just like the strange old-world city he had led me through. I hurried back to my hotel, my heart still racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what had happened. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and the place he had taken me. I tried to retrace my steps to find the alley where I had parted ways with him, but no matter how many times I walked those streets, I could never find it again. It was as if the city had swallowed it up, erasing all traces of that strange encounter. But the memory lingered, a haunting reminder that some guides don't just lead you through a city, they take you to places you were never meant to see. The experience has left me with a deep sense of unease, a chilling reminder that history is never truly in the past. And every time I walk through the foggy streets of Boston, I can't help but wonder if the ghostly guide is still out there, waiting to lead someone else on a journey into the unknown. Los Angeles is a sprawling city, and shortcuts can often save you a lot of time, especially in the busy streets at night. That evening, I found myself in a hurry, eager to get home after a long day. The usual route was clogged with traffic, so I decided to take a shortcut through a dark alleyway I had used once before. It wasn't the most welcoming path, but it would shave off a few minutes, and at that moment, that was all that mattered. As soon as I stepped into the alley, the city's noise seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost unnatural. The tall buildings on either side blocked out most of the light, leaving only the faint glow of a distant street lamp to guide my way. The alley seemed to stretch on endlessly, longer than I remembered, and the further I walked, the more uneasy I felt. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder with each step. About halfway through, I noticed something strange. The alley wasn't just stretching, it was twisting. The path ahead seemed to bend in ways that defied logic, curving sharply where it should have been straight. The familiar buildings I had seen countless times were now distorted, their windows dark and unwelcoming. My heart began to race as I realized that I had no idea where I was. The alley, once a simple shortcut, had become a maze, and I was trapped in it. I tried to backtrack, but the path behind me had changed as well. The familiar entrance was gone, replaced by more twisted walls and darkened corners. Panic set in as I realized that I was no longer in the alley I thought I knew. It was as if the city itself had turned against me, leading me into a place that wasn't meant to be found. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. As I continued walking, hoping to find a way out, I began to hear faint sounds, whispers, distant and indistinct, echoing off the walls. The voices were low, almost unintelligible, but they carried a sense of urgency, as if they were trying to warn me of something. I strained to listen, but the words remained just out of reach, taunting me with their secrecy. The whispers grew louder as I moved deeper into the alley, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure darting between the buildings. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. There was nothing there. The shadows seemed to shift and change, and I could no longer tell what was real and what was just my imagination. Every corner I turned led to another darkened path, another dead end. The alley twisted and stretched in ways that made no sense, and I began to feel as though I was walking in circles, trapped in an endless loop. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the presence of something, or someone, following me. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the twisted labyrinth I had stumbled into. No matter how fast I walked, alleys seemed to stretch on forever, walls closing in around me. The distant street lamp, once a beacon of hope, now seemed impossibly far away, its light growing dimmer with each passing second. Just when I thought I would never find my way out, I turned a corner and saw it. A narrow, barely visible exit at the far end of the alley. Relief washed over me, and I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound that made my head spin. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The exit was right there, just a few steps away. I burst through the opening, stumbling onto the familiar street outside. The noise of the city rushed back in, filling my ears with the comforting sounds of traffic and distant chatter. I turned around, expecting to see the twisted alley behind me, but it was gone. The narrow path I had just escaped from was nowhere to be seen, replaced by the normal, well-lit street I had walked so many times before. The experience has left me with a deep sense of unease. Chilling reminder that shortcuts can sometimes lead you to places you were never meant to go. The sinister alley, with its twisted paths and eerie whispers, still haunts my thoughts. And every time I pass by that part of town, I can't help but glance down the street, half expecting to see that dark, twisting path waiting for me once more. London's streets are full of surprises, but that night, as I waited at a familiar bus stop, something felt off. The night was cold, and the usual buzz of the city had faded into a quiet that was almost unsettling. I was standing alone under the dim streetlight, the distant sounds of traffic barely audible. The bus stop was one I had used countless times before. Tonight, it seemed different, like it didn't quite belong. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, wrapping around the street like a shroud. It wasn't unusual for London, but it added to the eerie atmosphere. As I stood there, the mist swirling around me, I began to notice that the street looked different. The buildings seemed older, more worn, their windows dark and lifeless. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the pavement. I checked my watch, feeling the minutes tick by, but the bus never came. Just as I was about to give up and walk home, a bus appeared out of the fog, its headlights cutting through the mist like ghostly eyes. The bus was an old model, one I hadn't seen in years, but it pulled up to the stop with a soft hiss, and the door creaked open. The driver, a shadowy figure in a dark uniform, nodded at me as I stepped on board. The inside of the bus was dimly lit, the seats worn and faded. I hesitated for a moment, but it was late, and I was tired, so I found a seat near the back and settled in. The bus moved slowly through the fog, the city outside reduced to shadowy shapes and blurred lights. I glanced around at the other passengers. Something about them felt wrong. They sat unnervingly still, their faces turned toward the windows, blank and expressionless. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if they were frozen in time, trapped in their seats. Chill ran down my spine as I realized that their eyes were empty, devoid of life. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread, telling myself that it was just the fog, just the late hour playing tricks on my mind. But the silence in the bus was oppressive, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't quite place. I shifted in my seat, trying to get a better look at the driver, but his face was obscured by shadows, his hands gripping the wheel with a strange, unnatural stillness. As the bus continued through the fog, I noticed that the usual landmarks were missing. The streets outside were unfamiliar, and the buildings looked like they belonged to another time. My heart began to race as I realized that I didn't know where I was, or where the bus was taking me. I stood up, intending to ask the driver where we were headed, but as I made my way down the aisle, the other passengers turned their heads in unison, their empty eyes locking onto me. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, my pulse quickening. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes seemed to follow my every move. Panic surged through me, and I hurried to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The driver remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if he were driving through another world entirely. I pounded on the door, shouting for him to stop, but there was no response. Just as I was about to give up, the bus slowed to a stop. The door creaked open, and I rushed out, stumbling onto the pavement. The fog was still thick, but I could see the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance. I turned back to look at the bus, but it was already pulling away, disappearing into the mist. As it vanished, I caught a glimpse of the passengers through the windows, still staring, still unmoving. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, but the street around me was empty, the bus stop nowhere to be seen. It was as if the entire experience had been a dream, a phantom ride through a world that didn't exist. The city was quiet, the fog slowly lifting, and the familiar sounds of London began to return. But the memory of that night stayed with me, chilling reminder that some bus stops lead to places you were never meant to go. In the days that followed, I avoided that bus stop, taking longer routes to avoid the place where the phantom bus had appeared. But the experience haunted me, a constant reminder that London's streets hold more than just history. And every time I see a bus emerge from the fog, I can't help but wonder if it's the same one, waiting to pick up its next passenger and take them on a journey into the unknown. Paris at night is usually a sight to behold, with its glowing lights and lively atmosphere. But that evening, as I wandered through the city, the usual charm seemed to fade, replay an unsettling stillness. I found myself in a quiet neighborhood, far from the busy streets where the buildings loomed overhead, their windows dark and lifeless. The night was unusually quiet, and the only sound was the soft crunch of gravel under my feet as I walked through a narrow alley. At the end of the alley, I stumbled upon a small courtyard. It was hidden away, tucked between old stone buildings that seemed to huddle together, their facades worn and weathered by time. The courtyard was empty, save for a few overgrown plants and a lone bench beneath a flickering street lamp. The light cast long shadows that danced across the cobblestones, giving the place an eerie, almost sinister feel. Despite the unease that had settled in my stomach, I found myself drawn to the courtyard. It was quiet, too quiet, and the stillness felt almost oppressive. I sat down on the bench, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had come over me. But as I sat there, the silence seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. The street lamp flickered overhead, casting the courtyard into brief moments of darkness before the light returned. As I sat there, I began to hear something faint, footsteps, echoing off the stone walls. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. The footsteps seemed to circle the courtyard, moving slowly, deliberately, as if someone, or something, was walking just out of sight. My heart began to race, and I strained to see through the shadows, but there was no one there. The courtyard was empty, yet the footsteps continued, echoing all around me. I stood up, my nerves on edge, and began to walk toward the exit. But as I moved, footsteps seemed to follow, their pace matching mine. The sound was unsettling, a soft, rhythmic tapping that sent chills down my spine. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps kept up, always just behind me, always out of sight. The courtyard, once a place of stillness, had become a place of fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Desperate to escape, I hurried toward the alleyway. But as I reached the entrance, the footsteps stopped. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there. The courtyard was as empty as before. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the flickering of the street lamp overhead. But the silence that followed the footsteps was even more unnerving. A deafening quiet seemed to wrap around me like a shroud. I left the courtyard behind, my heart still pounding in my chest. The memory of those footsteps haunted me. The way they had followed me, always just out of sight, always just beyond my reach, left me with a deep sense of unease. Courtyard, once a hidden gem in the heart of Paris, had become a place I never wanted to see again. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Every time I passed a quiet alley or a hidden courtyard, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to hear those footsteps again. The city, once so full of life and light, now felt like a place of shadows and secrets. Unseen eyes watched from the darkness. The experience has left me wary of the quiet corners of Paris. Chilling reminder that some places hold more than just history. And every time I find myself in a secluded courtyard, I can't help but listen for the sound of footsteps, wondering if they're following me again. Tokyo's streets can be a maze of narrow alleys and hidden corners, but I had always prided myself on knowing my way around the city. That night, however, something felt different. I had taken a familiar path home, one I had walked countless times before. But as I made my way through the quiet streets, the city seemed to change around me. The neon lights that usually guided my way were dimmer, and the bustling noise of the city had faded into an eerie stillness. I walked past the same shops and buildings I knew so well, but something felt off. The streets seemed narrower, buildings taller, as if the city itself was shifting. I tried to brush off the feeling, telling myself it was just the lateness of the hour playing tricks on my mind. But as I continued walking, the path ahead began to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. Corners appeared where there should have been none, and streets that should have led me home now stretched on endlessly. My heart began to race as I realized I was lost. I had taken this path so many times before, but now it felt like a different world entirely. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by darkened buildings and shadowy alleys that seemed to lead nowhere. The usual bright lights of Tokyo had dimmed, leaving only a faint glow that barely illuminated the streets. It was as if the city had decided to hide itself from me, leading me into a place that wasn't on any map. As I turned down another alley, hoping to find my way back, the surroundings grew even stranger. The buildings were old, their windows dark and empty, and the streets were lined with overgrown plants that seemed out of place in the heart of the city. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had wandered into a place that didn't exist in the real world. The path twisted and turned on itself, leading me deeper into the maze. I tried to retrace my steps, but every corner I turned only seemed to lead me further away from where I needed to go. The city had become a labyrinth, and I was trapped inside it. The streets were silent, the usual hum of the city replaced by an oppressive quiet that made every footstep echo unnervingly loud. I could feel the weight of the buildings pressing down on me, the narrow alleys closing in, as if the city itself was trying to swallow me whole. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadowy figure slipping through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. But the figure was gone, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. The feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore. The city, once so familiar, had become a place of lurking shadows and unseen eyes. Desperate to find my way out, quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing off the walls. But no matter how fast I walked, the path only seemed to twist further, leading me in circles. The buildings grew taller, their dark windows like empty eyes staring down at me. The air grew colder, and the faint glow of the city lights seemed to fade even further, leaving me in near darkness. Just when I thought I would never find my way out, I turned a corner and saw it. Faint light in the distance, barely visible through the gloom. I hurried toward it, my heart pounding, and soon found myself back on a street I recognized. The city had returned to normal, the lights bright and the noise of traffic filling the air once more. I glanced back, half expecting to see the twisted path I had just escaped from, but it was gone, replaced by the familiar streets I knew so well. The experience left me shaken, a chilling reminder that even the most familiar places can change in the blink of an eye. The forgotten path, with its twisted alleys and shadowy figures, still haunts my thoughts, and every time I walk through Tokyo at night, I can't help but wonder if the city will lead me back there again. New York City never truly sleeps, but there are moments, especially late at night, when the noise dies down and the streets seem almost empty. It was during one of those quiet nights that I found myself walking home after a long day. The buildings around me loomed tall and silent, their windows darkened, reflecting the city lights like blank eyes. I had taken this route many times before, but tonight something felt different, off. As I passed by one particular building, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing in the window on the third floor, completely still, watching the street below. It was late, and most of the lights in the building were off, but this figure stood there, motionless, silhouetted against the faint glow of a single lamp inside. I couldn't make out any details, but the presence of this midnight watcher sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just someone looking out the window, maybe lost in thought. But as I continued walking, I couldn't resist glancing back. The figure was still there, still watching. My heart began to race, and I quickened my pace, eager to put some distance between myself and the building. But even as I turned the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were still on me, following my every move. The next night, as I walked home, I passed the same building again. I hadn't meant to, but old habits die hard, and I found myself on the same route. To my surprise, the figure was there again, standing in the exact same spot, watching the street below. The eeriness of it all made my skin crawl. Who stands at a window night after night, doing nothing but staring into the darkness? I hurried past, refusing to look back this time. Over the next few days, I avoided that street altogether, taking longer routes just to avoid the unsettling sight. But the curiosity gnawed at me. What was the figure doing? Why were they always there? Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself walking down that street once more. This time I was determined to get a closer look, figure out who or what was behind that window. As I approached the building, I could see the figure clearly. It was the same as before, motionless, watching the street. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring up at the window, trying to make out any details. But the light inside was dim, casting the figure in shadow. My curiosity turned to dread as I realized that the figure wasn't just standing there. It was waiting for me. I quickly turned away, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wanted something from me, that it was waiting for the right moment to make its move. I hurried home, refusing to look back, but the image of that shadowy figure haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there, watching, waiting. That night, couldn't sleep. I kept imagining the figure stepping out of the building, following me through the streets, its gaze fixed on my back. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things. But the feeling of unease refused to go away. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. I went back to the building during the day, hoping to find some explanation for the figure in the window. But when I arrived, the window was empty. The light was off, and the building looked completely normal. I asked around, trying to find out who lived in that apartment, but no one seemed to know. It was as if the figure had never existed. The experience left me with a lingering sense of dread. I haven't walked down that street since, and I avoid that building whenever I can. But the memory of the Midnight Watcher stays with me. A chilling reminder that sometimes the city holds secrets that are better left uncovered. And every time I pass a darkened window, I can't help but glance up, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching, waiting for me. Berlin's streets have a certain charm, especially at night when the city lights cast a soft glow over the historic buildings. That evening, I was out for a late walk, enjoying the cool air and the quiet that had settled over the city. I had wandered off my usual path, letting the winding streets guide me wherever they pleased. It was a peaceful, aimless stroll, or so I thought, until I took a wrong turn. The street I found myself on was unlike any I had seen before. The cobblestones were worn and uneven, and the buildings on either side seemed older, almost ancient, their facades weathered by time. The street lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. It felt as if I had stepped into another time, another world, and the familiar comfort of the city began to slip away. As I walked further down the street, a strange sense of unease settled over me. The buildings were silent, their windows dark and empty. There were no signs of life, no people, no cars, no sounds. It was as if the street had been forgotten, lost in time. The further I walked, the more I realized that I didn't recognize anything around me. This wasn't just a wrong turn. It was a place I had never seen before, a place that shouldn't exist. I turned around, intending to retrace my steps and find my way back to the main road. But as I did, the street behind me had changed. The way I had come was gone, replaced by more darkened buildings and narrow alleys that seemed to twist and turn in impossible directions. My heart began to race as I realized I was trapped on a street that didn't want to let me go. I quickened my pace, hoping to find an exit, but the street seemed to stretch on endlessly, its layout shifting and changing with every step I took. The air grew colder, and the soft glow of the streetlights began to fade, leaving only dim pools of light in the darkness. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, the only sound in a world that seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. As I turned another corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The street in front of me was identical to the one I had just walked down, right down to the flickering streetlights and the darkened windows. It was as if I had been walking in circles, but the buildings had rearranged themselves to keep me from noticing. Panic set in, and I began to run, desperate to escape the street that seemed to have a mind of its own. No matter how fast I ran, the street wouldn't let me go. Every turn led me back to the same place, the same buildings, the same flickering lights. The city, once so familiar, had become a maze, and I was lost in its twisted corridors. The air grew heavy with a sense of dread, and I could feel the weight of the city pressing down on me, as if it was trying to crush me under its ancient stones. Just when I thought I would never escape, I saw a faint glow in the distance, a light at the end of the street. I ran toward it, my heart pounding, and soon found myself back on a familiar road. The street behind me disappeared into the darkness, and the sounds of the city returned, bringing with them a sense of relief. I had escaped the lost street, but the experience left me shaken, a haunting reminder that even in the most familiar places, there are hidden paths that lead to nowhere. In the days that followed, I avoided that part of the city, unwilling to risk finding myself back on that lost street. But the memory of it lingers, a chilling reminder that Berlin's streets hold secrets, some of which are better left undiscovered. And every time I wander the city at night, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to find that street waiting for me once more. San Francisco is known for its fog, but that night felt different. Fog wasn't just rolling in from the bay, it seemed to be swallowing the city whole. I had been walking home late, the streets unusually quiet, when the thick mist began to close in around me. The familiar landmarks disappeared one by one, obscured by the dense gray veil. The air was cold and damp, and the silence that accompanied the fog was unsettling, as if the entire city had gone to sleep. I quickened my pace, hoping to make it home before the fog became too thick to navigate. But the further I walked, the more disoriented I became. The streetlights, usually so reliable, barely pierced the fog, their weak glow swallowed up by the mist. The world around me felt small, confined to the few feet of visibility I had left. And in that fog, every sound seemed amplified. The soft echo of my footsteps, the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadowy figure, barely visible through the fog, following me from a distance. I stopped and turned, straining to see through the haze. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. My heart began to race as I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light playing off the swirling mist. The sense of unease settled deep in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I continued walking, the fog grew thicker, denser, until it felt like I was walking through a dream. The world outside the mist no longer existed. Just me, the narrow path ahead, and the creeping fog that seemed to close in tighter with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but all I saw was a wall of gray. The city's familiar sounds faded, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down on me. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft whisper carried on the wind. The voice was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the fog swirling around me, but it was there, unmistakable. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently, trying to make out the words, but the whisper was too quiet, too fragmented, as if it were coming from all directions at once. I turned in circles, searching for the source, but the fog was impenetrable, hiding whatever or whoever was out there. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Chorus of whispers, overlapping and intertwining, their words just out of reach. My skin prickled with fear as I began to walk faster, desperate to escape the suffocating mist. But the fog followed me, creeping closer, the whispers growing louder with every step. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to find my way out of the fog. But the streets had become unrecognizable, the buildings mere shadows in the distance. The fog wrapped around me, clinging to my skin like a cold, wet shroud. The whispers were everywhere now, filling my ears with their insistent, unintelligible murmurs. I could feel the presence of something behind me, something that moved with the fog, hidden in its depth. Finally, I saw it, faint light in the distance, barely visible through the mist. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning with the effort. The whispers seemed to follow me, growing more frantic as I neared the light. But I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just ran, fear driving me forward. When I finally reached the light, I realized it was a street lamp, and beyond it, familiar outlines of my apartment building. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and unyielding, but the whispers had stopped. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, but at least it was a silence I could understand. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, the memory of the whispers still echoing in my mind. In the days that followed, the fog lifted and the city returned to normal. But the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. The fog, once a familiar part of San Francisco life, now felt like something more, something alive, something that watched and waited. And every time the fog rolls in from the bay, I can't help but listen for the whispers, wondering if they'll return to haunt me again. Sydney's iconic bridges are a sight to behold, especially at night when they're lit up against the dark sky. That evening, I found myself walking across one of these bridges. Cool breeze from the harbor brushing against my skin. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, and the water below shimmered under the moonlight. It was a peaceful night, and I felt at ease, enjoying the quiet moment away from the bustling city. As I walked, the sound of my footsteps echoed softly on the metal of the bridge. The city seemed far away, and I found myself lost in thought, the rhythm of the walk soothing. But as I neared the middle of the bridge, something strange began to happen. The lights around me started to flicker, dimming and brightening in irregular intervals. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out what was causing it, but the source of the disturbance was nowhere to be found. The flickering lights created a disorienting effect, making the world around me seem unsteady. I glanced behind me, expecting to see the city lights and the familiar skyline, but what I saw made my heart skip a beat. The bridge behind me was gone, vanished into the night. The path I had just walked was now swallowed by darkness, the city skyline obscured by a thick fog that hadn't been there moments before. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized that I was stranded in the middle of a bridge that seemed to be disappearing. I turned back to face the direction I had been walking, hoping to find the rest of the bridge intact. But the fog was creeping in from that side as well, slowly swallowing the structure inch by inch. The lights on the bridge flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. The only sound was the soft lapping of the water far below and the distant hum of the city, now muffled by the thick fog that enveloped everything around me. With no clear path ahead or behind, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I was trapped, suspended in the darkness with no way out. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the fog, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything that would guide me. But the bridge continued to disappear, and the world around me seemed to shrink, leaving me with nothing but the sensation of being utterly alone. Then, in the distance, I saw a faint light. Flickered weakly, barely cutting through the fog, but it was the only thing that offered any hope. I started walking toward it, my footsteps tentative, the metal of the bridge creaking under my weight. Every step felt like it could be my last, as if the bridge might vanish entirely beneath me. The fog pressed in closer, wrapping around me like a cold, wet blanket. As I approached the light, I realized it wasn't coming from a street lamp or a passing car. It was something else, something that didn't belong on the bridge. Closer I got, the more the light seemed to shift and change, as if it were alive, pulsing with a strange energy. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but there was nowhere else to go. I had to reach the light, whatever it was. Finally, I stood before it. A small, glowing orb, hovering just above the surface of the bridge, cast a pale, eerie light that illuminated the fog around it but offered no warmth. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling. The moment I did, the light blinked out of existence, leaving me in total darkness once more. The bridge beneath me shuddered, and I felt a sickening lurch as if the ground itself was shifting. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for any sign of the bridge, any indication that I hadn't been completely abandoned in the fog. There was nothing. The world had gone silent, and the bridge was gone. I stood there, suspended in the void, unsure of what would happen next. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of the impossible situation. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, fog lifted. The lights on the bridge flickered back to life, and I found myself standing at the edge of the bridge, just a few steps away from solid ground. The city skyline reappeared in the distance, and the familiar sounds of Sydney returned, as if nothing had happened. I stumbled off the bridge, my heart racing, my mind reeling from the experience. In the days that followed, I avoided that bridge, unable to shake the memory of the disappearing structure and the eerie light that had led me to safety. Or had it? The experience left me questioning reality, a chilling reminder that some places in the world can change in the blink of an eye. And every time I see the bridge in the distance, I can't help but wonder if it will vanish again, waiting to trap its next unsuspecting traveler in the fog. Chicago's streets have a certain charm at night, with the city lights casting a warm glow on the pavement. That night, I found myself walking home after a late evening out, enjoying the quiet and the familiar hum of the city. Streetlights created a comforting path through the darkness, guiding me back to my apartment. But as I walked, something strange began to happen. The lights started to flicker. First, it was just a subtle dimming, like the lights were struggling to stay on. I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to an electrical issue or the age of the lamps. But as I continued walking, flickering grew worse, and one by one, the streetlights began to go out. The darkness crept closer with each extinguished light, swallowing the street behind me. My pace quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Further I walked, the faster the lights went out, each one plunging the street into deeper darkness. The city, usually so full of life, now felt empty, as if it had been abandoned in the blink of an eye. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps, louder now in the oppressive silence. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart skipped a beat. There was nothing behind me, just a wall of darkness where the street had been. Panic began to set in as I realized that the darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It felt alive, as if it were chasing me. I broke into a run, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the buildings as I tried to stay ahead of the encroaching blackness. The streetlights continued to vanish, one after another, and I knew that if I stopped, darkness would catch up to me. It was a terrifying race against something I couldn't see, but could feel creeping closer with every step. The cityscape around me twisted in the darkness, familiar buildings becoming shadowy shapes that loomed ominously overhead. The street, once so well lit, was now a path into the unknown, and I had no idea how much farther I had to go before I could escape. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself to keep running, desperate to stay ahead of whatever was following me. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a light in the distance. A single street lamp, still glowing brightly amidst the darkness. It was the only source of illumination left, and it felt like a lifeline. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning with the effort, and the darkness closing in behind me. The lamp flickered once, but then held steady, casting a small circle of light on the pavement. I reached the light, gasping for breath, and stood under its glow, feeling a strange sense of relief. The darkness had stopped just short of the circle of light, as if it couldn't cross the boundary. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but the street behind me was still gone, replaced by an impenetrable black void. The city was silent, the usual noise and movement gone, and it felt like I was the only person left in the world. I stayed under the light for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. The darkness seemed to watch me from the edge of the light, waiting for me to step out. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but there were no answers. Finally, the light flickered again, and I knew I couldn't stay there forever. Gathering my courage, I took a deep breath and stepped forward, hoping to find my way home. To my surprise, the darkness began to recede as I walked, the streetlights ahead of me flickering back to life one by one. The city slowly returned to normal, familiar sounds and sights reappearing as if nothing had happened. But the memory of that night haunted me, a chilling reminder that sometimes the darkness isn't just a lack of light, something more. In the days that followed, couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And every time I walked through the city at night, I found myself glancing at the streetlights, half expecting them to go out, plunging me back into that terrifying void once again. Toronto's streetcars are a familiar sight, their bright lights and steady rumble cutting through the city day and night. That evening, I boarded one of the last streetcars of the night, expecting a quiet ride home. The car was almost empty, just a few scattered passengers, and I found a seat near the back. The city outside was dark and still, the usual noise and bustle having died down as the night deepened. As the streetcar pulled away from the stop, I settled in, staring out the window at the passing buildings. The rhythm of the ride was soothing, the soft hum of the engine and the occasional clatter of the tracks lulling me into a sense of calm. But as we continued on, I began to notice something strange. The streetcar was quieter than usual, too quiet. The usual sound seemed muted, almost as if the city itself was holding its breath. I glanced around the car, and that's when I noticed it. There was only one other passenger left. Figure seated at the far end of the car, their face obscured by the shadows. They sat unnervingly still, not moving, not even shifting in their seat. At first, I thought they might have fallen asleep, but the longer I watched, the more I realized that wasn't the case. There was something unnatural about their stillness, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as the streetcar continued through the city, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The lights inside the car flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. The figure at the far end didn't move, didn't react to the flickering lights or the bumps in the tracks. They just sat there, frozen in place, as if they weren't really there at all. The streetcar stopped at another station, but no one boarded. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and we continued on, the city outside growing darker and more desolate. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the familiar streets and buildings, but instead, the city seemed to have changed. The streets were empty, the buildings dark and unrecognizable. It was as if the streetcar had veered off its usual route, taking us somewhere else, somewhere we weren't supposed to be. The silence in the car grew more intense, pressing down on me like a weight. I tried to catch the eye of the driver in the mirror, but their reflection was blurry, distorted, as if I were looking at them through a fog. My pulse quickened as I realized that I didn't know where we were, or where we were going. The streetcar felt like it was moving faster, the city outside a blur of shadows and shapes that made no sense. I looked back at the figure at the end of the car, and my heart skipped a beat. They had changed. Their form seemed to shift in the dim light, becoming less human, more shadowy, as if they were melting into the darkness around them. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them, unable to look away. The air in the streetcar grew colder, and I could feel the chill seeping into my bones. Panic set in, and I stood up, intending to move closer to the front of the car, away from the figure that now seemed more like a presence than a person. But as I took a step forward, the lights flickered again, and the figure shifted once more, this time turning slightly in my direction. I couldn't see their face, just the dark outline of their form, twisted and unnatural. A wave of fear washed over me, and I froze, unsure of what to do. Just as I was about to make a run for the door, the streetcar screeched to a stop. The doors slid open, and the cold night air rushed in, snapping me out of my paralysis. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the streetcar, stumbling onto the empty platform. The doors closed behind me with a soft thud, and the streetcar pulled away, disappearing into the night. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. The platform was deserted, the city silent and still. It took me a moment to gather my bearings, but when I finally did, I realized I was in a part of the city I didn't recognize. The streets were unfamiliar, and the buildings around me seemed older, almost forgotten. I turned to look back down the tracks, but the streetcar was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The experience has left me with a deep sense of unease. I haven't taken a late-night streetcar since, and I avoid that route whenever I can. But the memory of that night haunts me, a chilling reminder that sometimes familiar and become strange in the blink of an eye. And every time I hear the distant rumble of a streetcar, I can't help but wonder if that silent passenger is still out there, waiting for their next ride through the city's shadows. New Orleans is a city that never truly sleeps, and its streets are often filled with music, laughter, and the echoes of lively conversations. That night, as I walked through the French Quarter, the city's usual vibrancy seemed to linger in the air, even as the crowds thinned and the sounds of the day faded into the background. The old buildings, with their wrought iron balconies and flickering gas lamps, cast long shadows on the cobblestones, creating an atmosphere that was both charming and eerie. I had taken this route many times before, enjoying the quiet of the late hours, but that night felt different. The usual hum of the city was replaced by a strange stillness, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. As I turned down a narrow alley, the silence was broken by something unexpected, a soft, distant laugh. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable in the quiet of the night. I paused, glancing around, but the alley was empty. The laughter continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if it were coming from just around the corner. It wasn't the joyful, carefree laughter of someone enjoying a night out. It was something else, something darker. It echoed off the walls, bouncing back at me in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. The laughter seemed to retreat as I moved closer, always just out of reach. It wasn't long before I realized that the sound wasn't just retreating, it was circling me, moving from one side of the alley to the other, as if it were playing a game. My heart began to race, and I quickened my pace, determined to find the source of the haunting laughter. As I turned another corner, the laughter stopped abruptly, leaving behind a deafening silence. The sudden quiet was unsettling, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any sound that might break it. But there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the night and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I looked around, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows. The alley was empty. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it had all been in my imagination, a trick of the night. But as I continued walking, the laughter returned, louder this time, closer. It was no longer playful. It had taken on a sinister edge, mocking tone that sent chills down my spine. The sound seemed to surround me, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I felt as though I were being toyed with, as if the laughter was leading me deeper into the city's labyrinthine streets. Panic began to set in, and I started to run, my footsteps loud in the empty alley. The laughter followed me, growing more frantic, more unhinged, as if it were chasing me. No matter how fast I ran, the sound stayed with me, never fading, never losing its grip on my senses. The city around me seemed to blur, familiar streets twisting into a maze of shadows and echoes. Finally, I burst out of the alley and onto a wider street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. I stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath. The sense of unease remained. The city had returned to its usual quiet, but the memory of the laughter lingered, haunting reminder of the strange encounter. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the laughter hadn't truly left me. Every time I walked through the French Quarter, I found myself listening for it, half expecting to hear that mocking sound echoing through the streets once more. The city, with all its history and charm, now felt like a place where the past could reach out and touch you when you least expected it. The experience has left me with a lingering sense of dread, a reminder that New Orleans is a city of ghosts where the past and present intertwine in ways that can be unsettling. And every time I hear the faintest echo of laughter in the distance, I can't help but wonder if it's the same sound, waiting to lead me back into the shadows. Madrid's vibrant streets are usually filled with life, even late at night. But that evening, as I wandered through the narrow alleys and bustling plazas, something felt different. The air was heavy, the scent of rain, and the cobblestones were slick and shining under the dim glow of the streetlight. The usual hum of conversation and laughter seemed distant, muted, as if the city itself was holding back. As I walked, I noticed something strange. People around me, other pedestrians, couples strolling hand in hand, friends chatting as they passed by, began to disappear. It was subtle at first. A man walking ahead of me turned a corner. When I followed just seconds later, he was gone. I shrugged it off, thinking he had entered one of the nearby buildings. Then it happened again. A woman who had been walking just a few feet in front of me seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving the street empty. Chill ran down my spine as I looked around, realizing that the once crowded street had become eerily deserted. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the pavement, and the sound of my footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the silence. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. With every step, the city seemed to grow quieter, emptier. I turned down another street, hoping to find some signs of life. But the same thing happened. People who should have been there, people who had been there, gone. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I was alone. The city, once so full of energy, had become a ghost town, and the only sound was the soft patter of rain on the cobblestones. As I continued walking, the silence grew oppressive. The buildings loomed overhead, their windows dark and empty, and the streets twisted and turned in ways that made no sense. I felt as though I had stepped into another world, one where the normal rules didn't apply. The city seemed to stretch out before me, an endless maze of deserted streets and fading lights. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone, anyone. There was nothing, just the empty street stretching into the darkness. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the people I had seen had simply gone inside, out of the rain. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The way they had vanished so suddenly, so completely, felt wrong. It was as if the city itself had swallowed them up, erasing all traces of their existence. I turned a corner, and for a brief moment, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the street. My heart leaped with hope, and I hurried toward them, eager to find some company in the eerie stillness. But as I approached, the figure disappeared, gone in the blink of an eye. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the spot where they had been, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The street was empty again, the silence deafening. Panic set in as I realized that the city wasn't just empty, it was watching me. The shadows seemed to shift and move, as if something was lurking just out of sight. The streetlights flickered, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, tracking my every move. I began to walk faster, my footsteps echoing in the empty streets. But no matter how far I went, the city remained desolate, devoid of life. Finally, I reached a familiar plaza, its wide open space offering a brief respite from the narrow, twisting streets. But the plaza too was empty. The usual vendors and musicians were gone, and the fountains stood silent and still. I stood there, my breath coming in short gasps, trying to make sense of what had happened. The city had become a place of shadows and whispers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was next, that I would disappear just like the others. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Every time I walked through Madrid, I found myself glancing around, checking to make sure the people around me were still there. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, a reminder that even the most familiar places can become strange and unsettling in an instant. And every time I see someone turn a corner, can't help but wonder if they'll vanish, leaving behind nothing but an empty street. Moscow's old buildings have a certain charm, their worn stone facades and narrow corridors, a testament to the city's long history. That night, I found myself in one of these buildings, the creaky elevator out of order, forcing me to take the stairs. The stairwell was dimly lit, the bulbs flickering weakly as I made my way up. The building was quiet, the usual sounds of tenants coming and going absent, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and age. I had taken these stairs many times before. Something about that night felt different. The staircase seemed longer, the steps steeper, as if the building itself was stretching, pulling me deeper into its depths. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. As I climbed higher, the air grew colder, temperature dropping with each floor I passed. About halfway up, I noticed something strange. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling upward with no end in sight. I stopped to catch my breath, looking down to see how far I had come, but the bottom of the staircase was lost in darkness, steps below fading into the shadows. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that I couldn't see the top either, just an endless stretch of stairs disappearing into the gloom. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself that I was just tired, that the stairs only felt longer because of the late hour. But as I continued to climb, the sense of disorientation grew stronger. The walls seemed to close in around me, space becoming narrower, more confined. My footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the silence, the sound bouncing off the stone walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where I was. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A faint sound coming from below, like something or someone moving in the darkness. It was subtle at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each step I took. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, but something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the top and escape whatever was behind me. But the stairs continued to stretch on endlessly, and the sound from below grew louder, closer. It was as if the building itself was alive, the walls closing in on me, the steps rising higher and higher with no end in sight. Panic set in as I realized that I was trapped, caught in a never-ending loop of stairs that led nowhere. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me, as if the building was trying to swallow me whole. Desperate to escape, I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The sound from below grew more frantic, more insistent, and I could feel the presence of something behind me, closing in with every step. But no matter how fast I ran, the top of the staircase remained out of reach, the walls pressing in tighter, air growing colder and more suffocating. Just when I thought I would never escape, I saw it. Faint light at the top of the stairs. It was distant, barely visible, but it was the only sign of hope I had left. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning with the effort, and soon found myself at the top of the staircase, stumbling into a dimly lit hallway. The door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the sound from below, and I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. The hallway was empty, silent, but the sense of unease lingered. I looked back at the staircase, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows, but the door remained closed. The building had returned to its usual stillness. The memory of that endless staircase haunted me. I haven't taken the stairs since, and I avoid that building whenever I can. The experience left me with a deep sense of dread, a reminder that some places hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. And every time I pass by an old staircase, I can't help but glance at the steps, wondering if they'll stretch on forever, leading me back into the darkness. Beijing is known for its bustling night market, where the air is thick with the scent of food, the sound of haggling, and the vibrant energy of countless people. That night, I found myself wandering through one of these markets, drawn in by the lively atmosphere and the promise of delicious street food. The market was packed, as always, with vendors shouting out their prices and customers jostling for the best deals. It was a chaotic, joyful scene, one that I had experienced many times before. As I made my way through the narrow stalls, the usual noise of the market began to fade. It was subtle at first, like the sound was being gradually turned down. The chatter of voices and the clatter of cooking utensils became distant, almost muffled, as if someone had placed a thick blanket over the entire market. I looked around, confused, but everyone else seemed to be going about their business as usual, unaware of the strange change in the atmosphere. Then, one by one, the vendors began to disappear. It happened so gradually that I didn't notice at first. A stall that had been bustling with customers was suddenly empty. Vendor gone without a trace. I blinked, thinking I had just missed them packing up, but when I looked around, more and more stalls were vacant. The once crowded market was thinning out, the noise fading even further until only a few scattered voices remained. A sense of unease settled over me as I continued walking, my footsteps echoing strangely in the now quiet market. The lights seemed dimmer, the colors less vibrant, as if the life had been drained from the place. I glanced back, hoping to see the familiar hustle and bustle, but the path behind me was empty, stalls dark and abandoned. It was as if the market had begun to disappear, taking everyone with it. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized that I was alone. The vibrant, noisy market had become a ghost town in the blink of an eye. It quickened my pace, desperate to find an exit, but the stalls seemed to stretch on endlessly, their once bright signs now faded and unreadable. The air grew colder, and the scent of food that had filled the night was replaced by a strange, metallic tang that made my skin crawl. As I turned a corner, I saw movement. A lone vendor, still manning his stall. Relief washed over me as I hurried toward him, but when I reached the stall, I stopped in my tracks. The vendor was standing perfectly still, his eyes staring blankly ahead, unseeing. His hands were frozen in mid-motion, as if he had been caught in the act of serving a customer who was no longer there. The scene was eerie, like a photograph of a moment in time that had been left behind. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. The silence was oppressive, and I could feel my pulse quicken as I realized that the vendor wasn't really there, at least not in the way I expected. He was a shadow, a remnant of the market that had once been alive with energy. The emptiness of the place pressed in on me, and I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps as I searched for a way out. The market, once so familiar, had become a labyrinth of empty stalls and darkened alleys. The vibrant lights and sounds were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, suffocating in its intensity. The world around me seemed to warp and twist, familiar stalls stretching into dark corridors that led nowhere. Desperate to escape, I started running, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty market. The stalls blurred as I sprinted past, the darkness closing in from all sides. I could no longer tell which way I was going. Every path looked the same, every corner leading me deeper into the strange, vanishing world. The once bustling market had become a nightmare, and I was trapped in it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst through the exit and stumbled onto the street. The world outside was bright and normal, the noise of the city returning in a rush that was both comforting and overwhelming. I turned back to look at the market, but it was still there, unchanged from the outside, as if nothing had happened. The stalls were busy again, the vendors shouting their prices, and the smell of food filled the air once more. But I knew what I had seen, and the memory of that disappearing market haunted me. I haven't gone back since, unwilling to risk finding myself in that eerie silence again. And every time I pass by a night market, I can't help but wonder if it will vanish, just like the one in Beijing, leaving behind nothing but echoes and shadows. Bangkok's hotels are known for their charm, with their intricate decor and warm hospitality. But that night, as I wandered down the long corridor of my hotel, something felt off. The hallway was dimly lit, patterned carpet stretching endlessly ahead of me, and the air was thick with a musty scent that clung to my clothes. The walls, once so vibrant with ornate decorations, seemed to close in, the colors muted in the flickering light of the old bulbs overhead. It was late, and the hotel was quiet, the usual hum of activity having faded with the night. As I made my way toward my room, the corridor seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. The doors on either side were closed, their brass numbers gleaming dully in the dim light. I had stayed in this hotel before, but tonight, the familiar hallway felt different, eerie, almost sinister, as if something unseen was watching me from the shadows. It quickened my pace, eager to reach my room, but the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. No matter how fast I walked, the end of the hallway remained just out of reach. My footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the silence, the sound bouncing off the walls in a way that made the space feel even more confined. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. As I continued walking, I noticed something strange. The doors that lined the hallway were slowly disappearing. The numbers on the doors began to fade, the wood panels blending into the walls until there were no doors left, just a long, featureless corridor stretching into the distance. Panic began to set in as I realized that I was trapped in this endless hallway, with no way out. I stopped and looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The corridor, once so familiar, had become a nightmare. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the patterns shifting and warping in ways that defied logic. The air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, suffocating in its intensity. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft, distant tapping, like the sound of footsteps coming from the far end of the hallway. I turned to look. The corridor was empty. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if someone or something was walking toward me, hidden in the shadows. My heart began to race as I strained to see through the dim light. There was nothing there, just the endless corridor stretching into the darkness. I tried to backtrack, hoping to find my way back to the lobby. The corridor behind me had changed. The walls had closed in, the space becoming narrower, more confined. The tapping sound grew closer, louder, until it was right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there. The hallway was empty, silence deafening. Desperate to escape, I started running, my footsteps pounding on the carpet as I fled down the corridor. The walls seemed to close in further, the ceiling lowering until I felt like I was being squeezed into a narrow tunnel. The air was thick and heavy, and I struggled to breathe as I ran, tapping sounds still echoing in my ears. The corridor twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, the walls warping and bending as if the hotel itself was alive. Finally, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a door ahead. A single, solitary door at the end of the corridor. The brass number gleamed faintly in the dim light, and I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the door and threw it open, stumbling inside. The room was dark, but I didn't care. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. The tapping sound stopped, and the silence returned. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The room was empty, just as I had left it, and the corridor outside was quiet once more. But the memory of that endless hallway, with its shifting walls and eerie tapping, haunted me. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The hotel, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison, with its long, twisting corridors and dark corners. I haven't stayed there since, unwilling to risk another encounter, whatever lurks in those hallways. And every time I find myself in a hotel, I can't help but glance down the corridor, half expecting it to stretch on forever, leading me back into the darkness. Rio de Janeiro is a city that's always alive, even late at night. The streets pulse with energy, the music and laughter spilling out of bars and clubs, mixing with the sound of waves crashing on the shore. That night, I decided to take a late-night walk along the beach, enjoying the warm breeze and the glow of the city lights. The familiar sight of Sugarloaf Mountain silhouetted against the night sky made everything feel peaceful and calm. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The lights of the city, usually so bright and vibrant, seemed to be fading. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the eye. Maybe the lights were dimming as some businesses closed for the night. But the more I walked, the more I realized that it wasn't just the lights, it was the entire city. Buildings that had been there moments before were now gone, replaced by empty darkness. The bustling streets had become eerily silent, and the usual sounds of the city had disappeared. I stopped and looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The city, once so full of life, was vanishing before my eyes. The beach, usually crowded with people even late at night, was now empty, the sand stretching out into the darkness. The buildings along the shoreline were fading into the night, their lights flickering out one by one. Panic began to creep in as I realized that I was standing in a city that was disappearing around me. I turned to head back the way I came. The path had changed. The streets were gone, replaced by a vast emptiness that stretched out into the distance. The familiar landmarks had vanished, leaving behind only shadows and silence. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that I was alone, surrounded by a city that was slowly fading out of existence. Desperate to find my way back, I started walking faster, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. But no matter how far I went, the city continued to vanish around me. The buildings were gone. The streets were gone. Everything that had made Rio de Janeiro so vibrant and alive had disappeared, leaving behind only darkness. The silence was oppressive, and I could feel the weight of the emptiness pressing down on me, suffocating in its intensity. Then, in the distance, I saw a faint glow. It was the only light left in the entire city, a small, flickering beacon amidst the darkness. I hurried toward it, hoping it would lead me back to some semblance of normalcy. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from a lone street lamp, still standing amidst the disappearing city. The light flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the ground, but it was the only sign of life left. I stood under the street lamp, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched the rest of the city fade away. The buildings, the beach, the mountains, all of it disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing alone in a vast, empty void. The only sound was the faint hum of the street lamp above me, the last remnant of a city that no longer existed. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the void, but eventually, the light began to fade as well. Panic surged through me as I realized that I would be left in total darkness, with nothing but the empty space around me. Just as the light was about to go out completely, I felt a strange pull, like the world was shifting beneath my feet. The ground seemed to ripple, and the darkness began to recede. Slowly, the city started to return. The buildings reappeared, the streets took shape, and the sounds of the night returned, faint at first but growing louder. The city was back, just as it had been before, as if nothing had happened. The street lamp's light steadied, and I found myself standing on a familiar street corner, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of Rio de Janeiro once more. But the memory of that vanishing city stayed with me. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, a reminder that even the most vibrant and alive places can disappear in an instant. And every time I walk through Rio at night, I can't help but glance around, half expecting the city to vanish again, leaving me alone in the darkness.